Yo, how you doing, folks? Welcome to episode 114 of the Simpa Life Podcast. We are ticking along quite nicely. Back from my long break, as I spoke of briefly in the introduction to last week's video. As you may notice, I have fixed, look at it, look how beautiful it is. It's not going fucking crazy. It has taken me an hour and a half, but big shout out to OBS Stream Software for helping me figure out the manual settings of this camera, because as you've seen from the past couple of episodes, it has been a bit of a, epileptic fit-inducing visual hallucination. Frankly, it's been quite, difficult to deal with. Hope you're keeping well. Hope you are enjoying because the nice weather. We're in a new fucking nice weather. We're due some sunshine, apparently, folks. So do keep holding on if you are desperate for that vitamin D. The light will come with us, and knowing Britain, come and disappear within a week, but what a week it will be. All right, well, segue on very roughly to today's guest, because I am very eager to get this conversation rolling, because I think there is some great synergy and intersectionality between sort of our work and our philosophies and worldviews. So, yeah, without further ado, we'll jump into the introduction of today's guest, who is a reader in criminology at Lancaster University Law School, a former lecturer in criminology at Sheffield, Belfast, and London South Bank University, whose special interests include drug consumption, supply, cannabis cultivation, and green criminology, which I think that qualifies most of us as cannabis growers. I think we're green criminals. We'll find out shortly. Welcome, Dr. Gary Potter. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well. Thank you, Simpa. Very nice to be here with you, and looking forward to, I could explain green criminology, but definitely want to talk more about cannabis.
Excellent. I think there'll be some good, like I said, intersectionality and sort of crossover there. So we'll get into that shortly. I suppose a little bit of background for our guests. We met quite recently at the Beers event in Brighton, the Medicinal Cannabis Summit. Again, shout out Clark for actually making it the word medicinal, not medical. I do appreciate that a hell of a lot. It stopped me, scratching into my collar aggressively there and needing to outburst. So much appreciate. Gary actually chaired the panel that we were on. There was myself, Free Cannabis, who hopefully will be a guest coming soon. Robert Jappi, who again also should hopefully be a guest coming on very shortly. In fact, his business card is sat in front of me to remind me to contact him to get him on the podcast. And the wonderful Dr. Callie Seaman. And we had a brilliant talk. Oh, there was also Ace Sumner. Shout out Ace Sumner. And we had a brilliant conversation, and I think immediately after we finished, you and I made a beeline for each other to chat and go, kindred spirit, we recognize something here. So yeah, I've been eager to get you on. Brilliant to get you here. So yeah, for people that may not know, could you give us a bit of slight background of yourself?
Sure. I mean, you've done the basics. I'm an academic currently at Lancaster University, but I have been, as you say, to Belfast, London, South Bank, Sheffield, maybe a couple of others. My main, a specialist in drugs, but an absolute specialist in cannabis cultivation. I did my PhD on cannabis cultivation and how the UK cannabis market was changing from, or arguably had already changed, it's just no one had really noticed, had changed from a predominantly importation market to now a predominantly self-supply market. Actually, when I was doing my master's dissertation, which was on ecstasy dealing amongst student populations, and cannabis was a bit of an aside. And I just had like almost a footnote about how half a dozen of the people I'd spoken to grew their own cannabis. And to me, that was nothing special because I knew loads of people that grew cannabis. And my supervisor looked at, he gave me a good mark for the whole thing, flagged up that one paragraph and said, there's your PhD if you want it. We know this is happening, but no one's looked at it. The cops are behind, policy's behind, academia's behind. Write about your mates, you'd be a doctor. So here I am.
I like it. Again, it seems to be, again, a common theme. I think I brought this up last week with Ed Rosenthal, that we kind of go through our lives and then cannabis appears and it kind of goes, I really need to do something with this. And it's our walking companion throughout our journey of life. But interesting, again, your PhD was 2007, I believe. Is that correct?
That seems a depressingly long time ago, but yeah, I think that's right.
It's written in my notes. So I know it's correct when I've written it. As to whether it's then translated from when I've read it into my brain as the correct date, two different things. But yeah, interesting. Yeah, it is an oddity because obviously from the hash market then into more floral cannabis, the flower that we all sort of know and associate cannabis to be today, there really was I suppose to steal a modern term, this postcode lottery of access of certain people that got ahead of the game. The early lighting equipment, as we spoke of with Ed Rosenthal last week, was on the scene quite early. It was available for purchasing. in the early 90s, it really did take a while for certain, especially for genetics and things like that, for people to really get going with it. And I think it was maybe a few years earlier is when we kind of now retrospectively kind of look at that crossover point of say the amount that was seized from being a hash product or a resin product into being a floral product. And it's interesting now, somebody, I think maybe even one of your students could write a PhD on what is happening with importation and the evolution of the market, because it's changed again now because of the police and everybody else going so hard against home growers. The average hobbyist, especially now if we're competing with the open market, is in they were selling their excess product, not just being self-sufficient. They can't compete with the margins of, your imported Cali and then your Albanian networks, your Vietnamese networks, etc. So it's really changed that surface again, where it was, I imagine there was a period of time when those individuals would never really need to have any interaction with anybody else. They would have their own equipment, have their own seeds, their own genetics, and be self-sufficient.
I mean, what I always find interesting and worth reminding, like even myself, this isn't just me, I'm certainly not going to be lecturing you, Simpa, on sort of knowing what the cannabis scene is like in the UK. But the point is that it is so huge. There are so many users. There is so much. I mean, attempts to estimate what the value of it would be if it was a legal market vary, but comfortably in the billions, or at least the low billions. It's huge. There are millions of users. There are millions of transactions. So there are, whether it's sort of cultural or geographically, there are parts of the market that are increasingly dominated by organized crime, which is often, but by no means always, linked to Albania or Vietnamese or other communities. Should be very clear from the start, actually, that of course it is domestic white Brits that are most frequently involved in the organised crime side. Let's not point the finger at the Vietnamese and the Albanians just because they're foreign. But all of those groups are there, is my point. And there is still room and there's still hundreds, thousands, millions of domestic growers, home growers, some of whom still supply their friends, some of whom might be more nervous to do that because of local competition or local organised crime. Others haven't even, perfectly happy to do that. It's such a huge market, and there is organised crime, there is old school dealing, for want of a better word. There is this thing that academics call social supply. There are independent growers. There's this democratization of the market, is something that one of my colleagues has written about. And I think that's an interesting one. It's a huge market. Chunks of it are almost owned by the users. Chunks of it are still owned by the organised crime type suppliers. Of course, if policy and policing get stricter, it tends to favour the organised crime type suppliers and push, as you said, the more friendly growers out a bit more because they've got more to lose. Yeah, I could bang on about that, how, policy nearly always is the reason why markets get more problematic. Harms around cannabis markets are because of the way it's policed, the way it's illegal, not because of the plant or the majority of people involved in using or growing. I'll stop my rant and let you talk again.
No, that was very on point, and I think this is a good amuse-bouche for the podcast to come. Who was your colleague, if you don't mind? I'd like to look. So
that specific one, so I was thinking of James Treadwell and colleague whose first name I've forgotten and surname I think is Ankram. I don't always remember my references off the top of my head. I'm a very professional academic. My references are always in my writing, but I don't necessarily remember them off the top of my head. But James Treadwell is the name I associate with a particular study that was in some ways criticising some of my work and saying, don't over-emphasise this sort of friendly social grower. And his work was focused more on sort of almost traditional homegrown urban criminals in the north of England. So not the organised crime and not the independent growers. And he was saying, no, there's this group involved as well. But that was part of the point of recognizing there's so much going on. There's such a variety of growers. And in some parts of the market, it's been democratized. It's gone to the hands of the users.
Well, it is an interesting thing in that where there is a greater access, there's obviously greater options, which mean people can be more discerning. They can have those opportunities. And it's, from the experience and the life that I've been fortunate enough to live with it, I've been able to hold suppliers accountable. If a product turns up and it's substandard, you can go back to that individual, even if they are third, fourth in the chain, and things can be worked up. Often when you get to that kind of top level, that's where things get a bit sort of murkier, and that's where I agree with the sentiment that you made earlier. Obviously, the still, I would say, statistically speaking, it's going to be white British nationals that are going to be predominantly in the scene. One of the things that we're seeing, though, is a lot of the, as you spoke of there, the older dealers. I just call him Dave. Dave down the street is what we always call him on this podcast, and we always talk about Dave and his little cupboard grow. Like, as we spoke of, those individuals have either had to close down their kind of perceptibility in their what's what I'm looking for here, their position in society. So whereas, your Dave, say back in your 70s or 80s, and it's not necessarily too heavily policed, everybody knew what Dave did and no one gave a shit. No one dobbed in Dave and there wasn't a reason to do it. And so then, as you said, the increasing of policing of antisocial behaviour laws, etc., the modification of the cannabis laws, as we saw in the early 2010s or 20. How the hell do you say it? Do we say noughties? I hate that. Is that what we say?
I've not come up with a better term, so I think noughties.
The early 2000s. Yeah, that's what we're talking here.
Ahead of the new millennium.
There you go. Perfect. It's a mouthful, but it sounds a lot better in my mouth. Yeah, so there's all those kind of fuck arounds, and it's modified it, and now we're seeing the larger sophistications of certain, often disconnected but very similar organized entities that are Albanian nationals that are then buying up these old school supply chains. So these old school gangsters, they're living on beaches in Thailand, in Spain, or whatever, and they operate, or they own, and don't necessarily operate, but they have a line somewhere in the country that production here, distribution here, money goes here, gets laundered here, this goes here, everyone gets paid. There's a business model, as it were. They're now selling those models, those lines, to these individual networks rather than trying to compete with them. Because what the Albanians have done, compared to when we had sort of larger triad organizations up in the north, is they're cutting the market down through pricing. They're just increasing production. So then their wholesale pricing is going through the roof. So people are then walking away with buying boxes, kilos, and then sort of pallets, as it were. The pricing is getting to ridiculously low points. And my issue is where the money goes. These networks seem to operate on a 60-40 or similar percentage distribution. So 60% of the money that is generated from the product is then taken out of the community. It's then going back to Albania. It's my same issue that I have with legalization in these multinational conglomerates. They're not going to pay fucking tax here. Whereas that Dave, every penny that went into Dave's pocket would stay in that economy. His kids ate dinner that night because he sold a couple of 20 bags. The lads that he sold the 20 bags to, they didn't have to go to the runners on the bikes of the other networks and be involved in serious criminality. And it just so happened that obviously Dave smoking weed in the street, the cops on the bobbies, the beats, Bob beat. God, that is a sentence. The bobbies on the beat that then smelling the cannabis or whatever can then go and target him. Whereas then the distribution sites that are then produced in the amount that's produced in these sites is, if you lose a site, it don't fucking matter. If you put up 5 and 4 of them get raided, you've still got enough product that you can undercut everybody in that region and that market. And then again, all the profit from that is then leaving that community. We're now seeing Albanian national run hydroponic stores in the UK. And this is, again, I'm not being xenophobic or racist in anything I'm here. I'm just speaking of what I'm observing. And they are alleged to be running their own networks through that. So what they were doing for a while is going to hydro stores around the UK and trying to get wholesale prices for products, effectively then bullying them, trying really quite aggressive tactics. These are, again, statements that I've heard from innumerate hydroponic store owners across the country. Bear in mind that last year I visited, I think, nearly 200 shops as part of my Product Earth road trip. So I got to speak to a lot of the owners, a lot of the desk staff, etc. And now what they're doing is bypassing that altogether. They then went to the distributors and we're starting trying to bully the distributors. Distributors closed them down. So now what they've done is, you've got to think of the amount of money that these guys are offering. And so they're now setting up their own businesses to basically only cater to their own communities, which I've got nothing against as a tactic per se, but then the end result of that, like I said, is impoverishing the cannabis consuming communities in any given region. And so the way the Home Office have responded to this is going, okay, well then we're going to crack down on money laundering in the hydroponic industry. But all that's doing is getting rid of Dave's ability to take his money and go and buy his equipment to set his shit up to deal with it. It's every facet, every step. You couldn't design a system more to empower the criminal markets if you chose.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, you've got a few different things going on there. You've got your sort of almost fundamentals of economics. I mean, free market economics. Well, yeah, there is tendency for that to encourage large organizations. And once you're large, you're in a position to get larger and larger and larger. You can fight the competition, buy out the competition, whatever. Of course, the globalization aspect, people from whatever country, you're going to target your market where you find it. And so you've got sort of standard economic stuff going on, but then you've got the role of prohibition. And of course, lots of people think prohibition is the ultimate control, but it's not. Of course, prohibition removes all control. So illegal markets are the only genuine, completely free markets we have. So sort of linking them back together, the sorts of stuff that we see in free markets, because theoretically speaking, that's how free markets work, are normally constrained by at least some regulations, competition laws, for example, taxation, for example. In the illegal equivalent, you don't even have those checks and balances. So you do end up with a completely unfettered free market model, which does favor the big players. And once you've got disproportionality within the market, the dominant people just get more and more dominant. Add to that the fact that they're willing and able to use violence and threats of violence because they are operating already outside of the law. You're right. It's very much tipped against the small scale, independent, the Daves of the world, the Dave the dealer or the Dave the grower of the world is very much tipped against. But I feel that I'm more optimistic than you, but that may well be just that I'm not as plugged in as I should be at the moment. So you're sort of saying, and I'm not disputing it as such, but you are saying that there is almost the domestic individual Dave growers are a bit in retreat again because of the domination. That may be true. But they've also come from nothing, going back to this growing thing that emerged late 80s, 90s or whatever. More of the market than ever has been the case is still in the hands of hippie, social supply, Dave-type growers. I mean, maybe it's gone down in recent years, but it's still longer term a position that we could have only dreamt of 20 years ago, possibly. So hopefully it's sort of a blip rather than a complete reverse. I don't know. But I am optimistic in thinking I still know plenty of growers who do operate like the Daves you've said. And okay, maybe they're a bit quieter now, but it doesn't mean they've gone away. They might be a bit cautious, so you need to know the right people. It's a bit harder to get, but they're still there. I'm sure they're still there because I meet quite a lot of them. And we are going to see a tussle between the organised crime model and the sort of independent, democratic, but still criminal model. And we're going to see that tussle as long as cannabis remains illegal. Of course, if we legalise, we get potentially a similar competition. Are we going to legalise in a way that benefits big business, or are we going to legalise in a way that keeps the space for the small-scale grower, the independent grower? I guess that's all secondary to whether we're going to legalise. So there's lots of different things going on. Like you've got economics, and you've got the law, and you've got a mess at the moment.
Another issue is obviously energy pricing. Became a massive problem. Lockdowns as well meant that small-scale clandestine growers, a lot of them abandoned their spots, especially during the first sort of two lockdowns where the police had the right to stop you where you go and what you're doing. Yeah. If you got caught with taking your nutrients somewhere, for example, you were going to face an issue. And I agree with you. The point on the only regulation under prohibition is violence and money. Really, that you can buy something. You can throw enough money at it. If that doesn't work, you throw enough violence at it. One of those two will stick, and you will get what you want. And there isn't a monopolies commission, as you say. There isn't a workers' rights union. There isn't so many of the things in place here that need to be. And I think it's a nuance that's missing from this conversation is that the people that are then seeking to legalize cannabis ahead of decriminalizing, or my preface would be decriminalization through descheduling the plant, which is what, oddly enough, some of the Republicans in America are going for. I do apologize, folks, if you can hear them cutting the grass outside of my window there. To deschedule, to then remove the individual punitive penalties for this, because I think, as I mentioned, the Brighton event, is, from my interpretation, is cannabis is legal. It cannot be criminalized because it is a neutral article and object. It is our actions with it that are criminalized. And I think that misunderstanding is this tiny little stick that they've built this monolith upon of this idea of legalization, and that no, you cannot grow a plant at home and be responsible for yourself and make your own decisions. We have to. And if we can just get people to understand this linchpin, their argument falls down and we go, well, why do we need taxation? Why do we need these other things? I mean, my argument is, I try not to be offensive, and I again hold my hands up to anybody in the LGBTQ plus IA community. I'm not trying to be offensive here with this comparison, but I see it as being a similar thing. I like drugs. I always have liked drugs because of my neurological makeup, because of the trauma of my youth. I find it helps me with social anxiety. It helps me connect with other human beings. It helps me expand my empathy. It helps me deal with my neurodivergency. I could list this for hours. But the point is, that is a thing that I enjoy and I choose to do. Protect me. That's as far as an argument as I think ever needs to be had with this. The rest of it is then bureaucracy through regulation. It is through creating, how do you regulate marketplaces and whatever else? That is secondary. Third, the first argument is anything that isn't short of decriminalization means the continued persecution, criminalization, and demonization of people. And I mean, I'm protected with a script these days, but Jesus Christ, yesterday, I came out of a lovely bit of road that we have up here in Durham that I'm not going to mention because I want to keep it a slight bit of a secret. But it's a back single-laned road that it's 60 national limit. Wonderful thing to drive at certain times of year. This time of year, the overgrowth isn't too high, so you can see the whole length of it. So you can have a bit of fun, allegedly. I'm going to say here, I have to be mindful. And I'd come out of this doing lawful speed, but it obviously maybe not sounded it in the way that I was driving my vehicle. And there's a cop at the other end of it. And I kind of went, oh shit, cop. And rather than thinking of the traffic violations, I was then thinking of, cannabis. And I'm going, well, I've got my script here. I've got my pot there. I've got a lawful defense. But I was still then paranoid and worried of this interaction. 5 minutes later, when I pull up to the front of my house, I pull up in front of it. There's a riot van on the opposite end of the street. As I pull up, the cops get out of the van, and I'm like, I've done it now. I don't know what the hell I've done, but I've done it. And they just walk past and they go to the food places on the end. We've got like a sandwich bar and a Chinese and whatever. But that fear, that paranoia, that anxiety, I shouldn't have to live this way. In the same way that we have this argument with feminist equality, and I agree entirely with this, no woman should be fearful walking down the fucking street. So then as a society, we go, okay, let's address that. That's a problem. Somebody shouldn't be forced to feel that way as a consequence of the construct of our society. And I think the same is true with drugs, but there are so few people that want to have this. Everyone's like, harm reduction, this and this and this. And it's like, I don't care about any of that, frankly. That's, again, still secondary. The idea that you can lock me in a cage to protect me from doing something you don't like. I can go to McDonald's and kill myself with food. I can go to the pub and drink myself to death. I can lawfully get in a plane and parachute out and risk dying. I can get in a scuba diving tank and risk the bends. I want autonomy, responsibility. I want to be left alone, the sovereignty to make those bad decisions. And if I fuck up, you know what your responsibility is as government? Protect me.
Yeah. I mean, I think, obviously I agree with everything you say. But I'm here as a criminologist to sort of bring in a slightly different perspective. Like the whole point of the criminal law is supposed to be to regulate the forms of behavior that, if they went unchecked, would be harmful to society itself. That's the justification for the state getting involved. And of course, criminal law involves punishment if you breach it. So there has to be some kind of justification for the state impinging harm on its thing. That justification should be preventing a greater harm. But a greater harm to society. Like, there should only be room for the criminal law to come into play when the behaviors are clearly and unequivocally, if left unchecked, harmful to society at large. It's not about harmful to the individual. We should all have free choice to harm ourselves. The harms that come from drug use, whether it's cannabis or other drugs, where there are harms to other society, to society, and of course there are, but it's very clear that those harms are generally created or exacerbated by prohibition. It's like the criminal law is creating the social harm. It was completely the wrong way around from how criminal law is supposed to work. You can go back to, the Enlightenment period, the social contract theorists, and where does the idea of a criminal law and just intervention or just interference by the state on individual behavior come from. And you cannot match current drug laws onto that sort of philosophical or theoretical underpinning of where governments are justified in restricting individual freedoms. So it's crazy. And yeah, I just want personally to also let me do my thing. Sure, if it turns out that what I'm doing genuinely and always is going to be harmful, then yes, step in. We can't legalize murder, obviously, but that's not the same thing. You get the point.
Yeah, and we usually speak of law in the sense of antiquity and in its classical sense, it came from morality. And there's a wonderful stand-up by George Carlin, and he breaks down the Ten Commandments into one thing, and he breaks it down to violence. And he says that all these things are forms of violence, and it's that it should not be unjustifiably violent to one another.
Yeah.
And even then, I think in a different show, he's on about the idea of war, of lawful violence is just a bit paradoxical to human nature, even though we are and have the capability for violence. But our intellect gives us the ability to negate that. So surely we should use our intellect to better construct society rather than, it seems, weaponize certain parts of it against others. It's an oddity. Yeah, you speak of like the history of policing, like Sir Robert Peel and the Peelian principles. It's not one of those 9 principles are compatible with at least the way that the Misuse of Drugs Act is being enforced. I think when you look at if you generously, obviously you're an academic, you know how to understand, how to read these things in different kind of contexts. There is a loose interpretation of it that could say that the authors were trying to create get-out clauses. They were trying to create ways in which, if interpreted generously, we could have had a far better ride over the past 50, 60 years than we have had. But it seems to have, as often all legislation, when it's written in ambiguous, not quite clearly defined, or rather they do it in a legalese, but with a colloquial interpretation, they can choose at whatever time in history they want to give whichever interpretation to. And so I think because of the succeeding governments that came from that, their compounding interpretations lost the spirit of it, as it were. So I think that there is something in that actually, if we put all drugs into the Misuse of Drugs Act, and I'm including cane, sugar, tobacco, and fucking alcohol, then we'd have a rational conversation. Because, okay, if we want to keep the same level of supply for alcohol, we have to then work out the licensing and structure of all of the drugs, of their quantitative harms to the individual, to society. And as you quite eloquently and correctly point out, the vast majority of these are either progenited or promulgated or perpetuated by prohibition. Then when you look at these factors, like cannabis is a wonderful one in that somebody allegedly, potentially, like myself, that maybe allegedly grows their own, could be entirely self-sufficient. I pay tax, allegedly, maybe if I did it or did not in this situation, on my newts, my feed, my lights, my water. I'm a good tax-paying citizen for all that I'm doing there, and I wouldn't, in this hypothetical situation, need to interact with anybody else at all. Tell me where the harms are from that to society. If I then go out stoned as fuck and crash my car or whatever, I crashed my car. That's the thing that needs the attention. In the same way that alcohol, we don't give people a pass of going, well, you bat that guy with a fucking traffic cone and broke his nose. Or you can put him in a mitigation of that as a factor, and it depends on the judge, the interpretation, your character, and a multitude of other things as to whether that would be taken into consideration. But the law is the fucking law. Your action is what matters. And I just want that responsibility, that you can't go, that smackhead. No, a person on heroin broke a law. Now erase the person on heroin part. Person broke the law.
Yeah,
that's what we need. In responsibility. If I'm responsible at 18 to go and knock up a woman, to go and gamble away my whatever money I may have at that point, get myself into debt, sign up for infinite debt into education, go off and kill somebody lawfully in the military, any X number of things. I should be able to be given the space to do the same thing. I think this is why cannabis is the crux on this, because once we win cannabis and the idea that it should be looked at, I suppose, like tobacco was maybe 20 years ago, as just a thing that's not necessarily all indoor offices and whatever. That's not what I'm saying. I was just meaning less demonized in the packaging, but ubiquitously socially acceptable. Then all the other drug arguments fall apart. They absolutely fall apart. Anybody that's been to a nightclub in the past 20, 30 years, you've got the free party scene and the evolution of the rave culture to thank for that. You've got some very astute business individuals that understood how to play certain games and allegedly maybe pay off certain individuals to allow certain things to happen. But the structure that we have now is because of those victories. And now we're seeing this crackdown again in clubs on drugs that are meaning that we're going towards different fucking compounds. People are preloading and doing different things that are, again, putting themselves in jeopardy. And I don't know how we get to this point in the culture to have this conversation of going, well, What's the reasonable thing here? Because I try doing it with people with their kids going, oh, you've got a child, haven't you? They're a teenager. What would you rather? And you explain to them about adulteration in supply of compounds and stuff like this, and they just, well, you've got to ban them all. You've got to ban them all. And then you go, well, they're going to do it anyway.
Yeah.
Unless you lock them in their bedroom and watch them, they are going to want to do, or at least they'll have for the next 15 years, or that's it, 5 to 15 years, have a higher propensity on just percentage and statistical likelihood to want to experiment with these things. So therefore, while they're vulnerable, let's maybe help them.
Don't forget also the forbidden fruit effect there. They actually saying no makes things more attractive to teenagers as they're growing up. Rebellion's a huge part of growing up, and rightly so. And I'm sure we'll remember it.
And I think the harder you push that, the worse it gets. I mean, there is a comparison maybe there with the Catholic Church, and it's reiteration of don't sodomize children. But that's a whole nother question.
I grew up Catholic, but let's park that one to one side. I've back away from that a long, long way.
It's quite a topic.
I can't remember. We know also we've had 50 years of prohibition. We know it doesn't work. Why do we keep pressing the same thing? We do have this Misuse of Drugs Act. It's 51 years old this year, 52 years old. I've slightly lost track, but we're in 2023, which demonstrably has not worked, whatever its aims are. And actually, sort of going back to the wording of the act, somewhere in the preamble, like the rationale for the act, it makes it very clear this is supposed to be about harm reduction. That is supposed to be the priority of our drug legislation, is to reduce harm. We've got 50 years of evidence to show not only that it has not reduced harm, it has actually generated more harm. It falls on its own rationale. But unfortunately, that's not enough to dismantle it. Why does it still exist? Well, it's always harder to sort of change laws once they've settled in, because we do put a lot in store by precedents. It takes more effort to repeal than sort of ignore. Maybe I won't go too far down the legal details, if you like. But it's got momentum, if you like. Politicians, we've got the Tories, we've got Labour, both saying, we wouldn't change the Drugs Act, and if anything, we'll enforce policing, because as I understand it, essentially there seems to be more risk of losing voters by coming across as liberal than gaining voters, because in one sense, because all the liberal voters are like, well, it is illegal and we've got to base our voting on something else. Although I do think if any party did come out and say, actually, we really are going to fundamentally change drug laws, they probably would see an uptick in voting. But the point I think is that for people who are anti-drugs, that probably is an important part of how they vote. People who are pro-drugs or pro-legalization or pro-liberalization or pro-freedom, let's not say pro-drugs, it's about pro-freedom. It's not the biggest thing, actually. So we're stuck with legislation because it's politically convenient, because it already exists, because it's politically convenient to keep it. And once it's there, of course, arguably the police do have to enforce it, because we do want the police to enforce the law. We wouldn't like a society where the police pick and chose what they did enforce. So I've always got sympathy for the police, not necessarily the way they do things, but the fundamentals of having to enforce the law. The criminal justice system itself is not at fault here. The politicians are at fault by, sticking to a law that has long been proven not to work, that is politically expedient to hide behind, and easier to keep than repeal.
Exactly that, like I said, because there is always going to be more pressing topics, especially for 15 years of Tory rule. I mean, no matter what comes next, as long as it isn't Tories, they're going to spend their first fucking parliamentary cycle just trying to figure out what the fuck, and just trying to slow the decay and rot within the country and the institutions that have been privatized and picked clean. I think drug policy, again, unless they can, this is where the economic argument of legalization, I think, is going to win the day ultimately. Well,
I think that economic argument is what has carried it. I mean, you mentioned earlier how the Republicans in America are not so far away from, we probably would both generally find that our politics are a long way away from the Republican Party. But actually, when it comes to cannabis legalization in America, there's as many red states as blue states that have gone down the legalization route. I mean, I'm saying that, I don't know if it is as many, I haven't got the count, but there are red states as well as blue states. Forget the as many bit. So Alaska, for example, very much a red state, very much moving down the very similar legalization route as some of the others. Because actually you have got sort of meeting on the other side, the Republican, or on the one hand, the freedom for the individual. appeals actually to right-wing ideologies in a way that our conservatives seem to have forgotten, but in a way that parts of the Republican Party haven't. And also the tax. And, to bring this back to the last thing you said, it is going to be the economic argument that probably wins today. It's what won the day in lots of the American states. It is what arguably helped win the day in Canada, when we do see more and more evidence that, actually the state would benefit, private businesses would benefit, tax revenues, etc. We will see more and more of the right get behind legalization. So maybe in the not too distant future, we'll all be fighting for the same thing, even if it's for fundamentally different starting points.
It's going to be interesting because if legalization comes without some form of automatic decriminalization, I'm going to end up being the lone dissenting voice against the tidal wave, because if a corporation is allowed to do it, if it can be, all of the arguments against cannabis are currently being proven wrong by the very existence of a privatized medicinal system in this country. Yeah, every argument, every single argument. And again, it comes down to the responsibility element of it, that even if they get it down to, as they're trying now, some of the clinics, I think, are $4.50 a gram or whatever, the calculation of what you can then produce ounces of your own varieties, and you get all of the health and mental benefits of gardening, of being self-sufficient, of taking the autonomy of your life and being proud of sharing this thing with your friends. Look, I did this, I made this, and to nurture something to... It's made me a softer person. I was an arsehole before I started growing weed, however many years ago it was. Well, gosh, way back when. I'd never grown house plants. Sorry, my equipment is going mental. I'd never grown houseplants or anything like that. I'd never really interacted with nature. I didn't really enjoy going out in the trees or anything like that. Now I do wild camping. I have probably 30, 40 houseplants kicking around in every different room, not any too bloody dark. I have such an appreciation for nature. I'm a softer person. I'm a kinder person. I'm a gentle person. And I've saved over the years of when I haven't grown, comparatively so much fucking money that, it may have come out of Dave's pocket down the way, but there's plenty of people still going to always want to go to Dave. Even if everyone that wanted to grow grew today, there will still be enough of a market for Dave. And then guess what? There'll still be enough of a market for a McDonald's, Starbucks, and this massive conglomerate corporate system. And I just worry that, again, it's that weaponization of language. If they have legalization plus decriminalization, to me, that's descheduling. Because then once the plant is descheduled, it falls automatically into already pre-existing regulations of like health and safety, hygiene, sanitation, those kind of things. Don't dare. And so, what I get to do with it at home in the same way, I can bake cakes. Mr. Kipling isn't going to come and fucking send the cops for us. Do you know what I mean? I grow tomatoes and make ketchup. Heinz isn't going to come at me. Yeah. Alcohol, the same.
Alcohol and share it with your friends. You can't, and arguably rightly so, you can't brew your own alcohol and sell it commercially. But if you do, then there are extra rules come in to have a license. You need to meet certain requirements, and
if you violate those rules, you get a letter to, we're taking you to court and you're going to be fined $1,000. They're not going to take the door off and drag you out in your underwear and put a knee on the back of your head in front of your street and embarrass you and ruin your social capital. It's a mere infraction, sir. That's what I want. Is it treat it like it's a speeding offence? For all I fucking hate it when I get caught speeding or whatever. Fair play to you. You told me there was a camera. I should have seen the camera. I should have been playing the game. Well, a gentlemanly thing. Fair play, sir. Fair play. Happy with that. Happy for the cops to exist in those kind of realms. For all it pisses me off and I would change it, I can see its rationale as reason-ish. But say rape, violence, all those other things, entirely. There is no argument against that and will never be against. I'm not against the police. I'm against the current construct and execution of the powers and the apparatus that is collective policing. I mean, the fact we have 41, 43, whatever it is, different constabularies, and the whole act being devolved now of they've put a political person into the police force that just gives the politicians a reason to say, "I don't fucking fault, it was that guy." And that guy's got not enough power to actually do a thing because he's then got to deal with the top cop, and then they've got to deal with the federation, and then they've got to deal with the union. And it's just, oh my God, it's like, it's because I'm bouncing around so much.
You know, that only started moving when you said that you used to be an arsehole. I think maybe your camera is trying to say, well, maybe you still are.
Trying to wind me up till I prove I still am.
Let's push him. Let's test this. But yeah, I mean, God, we could talk a whole other thing about the structure of policing and the way policing works or whatever. And, I think there clearly needs to be some criminal laws we've talked about, but they should protect people from violence and exploitation. They should allow society to function so that everybody, there's social contract. We all give up some freedoms for the general benefit of us all being able to actually enjoy our lives productively and successfully and whatever. And we want a bit of protection from the state, and we concede that we're not going to run around like killing each other or stealing from each other or whatever. And you need a police force to ensure that. I think we do all agree on that. I think most people, even, the defund the police like campaigners, are actually, yes, what we are against is the way that policing has taken shape, not the fundamental idea of policing. So I do have some sympathy with the police, and they are, constantly given conflicting advice, instructions, responsibilities, whatever. We see plenty. I mean, the 41 UK forces or 41 English forces or whatever it is. I should know that. But we see enough variation there to see that even that can work. We have that postcode lottery. We can bring it back to drugs. There are parts of England where cannabis is effectively decriminalised because senior police officers have made a sensible decision to say, this isn't a priority, this is a waste of resources, we don't think it's right to police it, so we're not going to. And I wish I lived in one of those areas. But it shows that could be done anywhere. It shows that actually there's not something fundamental about the existence of cannabis smoking that needs to be policed. Because in those countries, in those constabularies where they've done that, it's not like they've seen an increase in violent crime, organised crime, other problems. Often they've actually seen a benefit of, because we're ignoring cannabis and can prioritise other things, they've seen a dual benefit of the reduction of violent crime, serious crime, because they can actually concentrate on that and fight it. So there is room for things to work even without fundamental change, but we probably want some fundamental change as well. I was going to say another thing, because something at the beginning of your last little bit, I was going to say, I find it really interesting, linking back to like legalization and the right and the left and what happened in America. And I sort of mentioned there are some right-wing states that have gone down legalization where the driving force has been the individual freedom but more likely the economic benefits of legalization. And that's interesting. But I also wanted to mention Vermont, which delayed legalization and originally turned down the original proposals for legalization precisely for the things you were talking about. The fact that the model proposed left the market in the hand of big business and didn't leave space for individual small-scale growers to carry on. And I kind of like that there was a left-wing state that was against legalization, which on the face of it looks ridiculous. But because they were, if we're going to do this, we're going to do it properly. I found that really interesting, and I think they've got a better proposal in Vermont now, and it's coming through. But it is really important, whatever the future is, that, well, there has to be legalization. I take that for granted. But when we do have legalization, there has to be space for individual, small-scale, self-supply, social supply, self-medication. There has to be space for this. Otherwise, we remove the set of problems that are prohibition and replace them with another set of problems. There's got to be space for the individual growers. And as long as there isn't, you'll just end up with individual growers doing it anyway and running the risk of being labelled criminals, which brings us back to where we started.
Yeah, so I wonder, just trying to think of what the slogans are going to be. So the UK legalises, and I'm sat there going, it's time to, I can't say legalise cannabis anymore. I can't say, it's still going to have to be decriminalised, and everyone will go, but it's legalised. And I'm going, well, yeah, but they've said you can grow 4 plants at home. Grow 5 and see what happens. They've said you can have an ounce on the street. Have an ounce and 1 gram in your pocket and see what happens. Any arbitrary limit is a violation of our basic right, and I can't seem to get people to understand this. And I just feel often quite alone in my stance here, in that I'm willing to give my life. I don't want just a boot off my neck. I want to get off the floor and get out of the fucking interrogation room and out of the prison complex and go and live. I'm not willing to just take, no, because we're different in the UK, and every other country is entirely different because of the construct of we're a fucking constitutional monarchy without a constitution. Do you know what I mean? We have no protections. The parliamentary structure of the upper and lower house with the House of Lords and the MPs and hereditary peership basically means the dickheads of the MPs that make the laws that the establishment and the elite like, they get put into the House of Lords to protect those laws. So because of our accountability that we pass the thing up 3 times, has to be approved, and then goes off to be royal assent and made into law, they can just block anything. So if we get the wrong legalization model in this country, we may have to wait a generation for these fucks to die out of the Lords for then just to have the conversation, because all they'll ever do at the pulpit is say, you've got legalization. In the same way now what they do, 2018, the law changed for medicinal access, and they're now saying, well, that's all we need to do. It's not a parliamentary problem. It's a prescriber problem. It's a regulatory problem. It's a this problem. And they'll just perpetuate the same bullshit for generations while thousands more get caught up. And it's not about just whether you get caught or not, whether you spend time in the cell or not. Have you ever heard of the panopticon?
Yes, you know.
Yeah. Of course you have. You're a criminologist, of course you have. Yeah. But for people that don't, I have this light. I'm sorry, I'm not an asshole. Yeah, so the panopticon, was it 16th century, 17th century? Was it later than that?
We're going back to... I think we're going back to utilitarians. Jeremy Bentham, aren't we?
Yeah.
I'm always bad at dates, but we're going back a few hundred years, yes.
Yeah, so a good period of time, yeah. So Bentham came up with this concept of a panopticon, which is like a circular prison. So all the cells face into the center. There's a central column and there's a guard station, but they can't observe when the guard is seeing them when they can't. So then they found that the sort of the psychological impact and effect of this would mean that everyone would assume that they're being observed at all times, ergo they could be caught and punished for anything they do, so they're less likely to then do the thing. The effect that this has on that person's brain over a protracted period of time, man. We've seen this within the evolution through behavioralism and Skinner and even Pavlov and all these other people talking about conditioning and programming, all these other things that we now live under a self-policing state that if you consume a drug, you are going to be paranoid, but not because of the fucking drug, but because of that tiny little thing in your pocket. Your whole life could end. That one pill could either kill you because of adulteration as a consequence of prohibition, or worse, you get caught. Well, not worse, obviously dying is the worst thing, but you're getting caught by the police and then being dragged through that system, and then your professional mum and dad, how could you do this? Throwing you out of the house, you become destitute, and your career prospects, you're out of uni, it's the drugs didn't do fuck all.
Absolutely, yeah. It's the criminalization is the problem, not the drug thing itself. I mean, it's always a bit anecdotal, but it seems to be quite widely supported, if you like. The whole concept of the bad trip, like the paranoia that can go with LSD use, really genuinely did not exist until LSD was criminalized in America. And then it became a thing. And it was very much to sort of oversimplify, and, paranoia can be a really serious thing, that you're suddenly thinking, oh, they're out to get me. Well, because under prohibition, they are. It's like, the law, it's another example. We've talked about this a lot, but it is another example. It is the law that is causing the problems. And you've just, we've talked about the law generates the space for the criminal market to control it, and therefore the harms go with organised crime. The law undermines the ability to regulate the products, or the harms that go with poor product or adulteration or whatever. But it's also the law that, alters the mindset of the user and makes them paranoid. It's the law that applies that stigma that may well mean that, paranoid or not, if they are outed or known as a drug user, criminal sanction or not, people risk losing jobs, losing careers, whatever. I will proudly and regularly say where I can, I am a drug user, but I'm lucky that I work in a sector of society where I can say that. I'm a criminologist in a liberal university in a fairly liberal country. I'm aware of the privileges that are there. Loads of other people who are similar drug users to myself could never admit that. And they do have not just the risk of actually being criminalized, but the extra risk of the stigma on top of that. The loss of friends, the exclusion from social circles, the inability to get mortgages or loans, the potential harder access to medical conditions to medical help if you've got a history of, a public record of being a drug user.
I think it's important here. I'll reiterate this for people who haven't heard me in the past several times. I've mentioned this again, but it is worth bringing up because something needs fucking done about it. In the NHS coding system, which is the internalised system where they record your healthcare, if you admit to a healthcare professional that you use drugs or are a consumer of drugs, there is no code for use. There is only one code for abuse. You will automatically be recorded it. So your doctor can lie to you and say, oh, wait, that's wonderful. I read a study about blah, blah, blah. If they've put it in your notes, you are now got that cemented on your records, and it remains as an open investigation until you can get a more compassionate GP to close it. I say this because I've just had to have investigations closed from the early 2000s discussing me being an alcoholic and shit and all sorts of just insanity. And it's like, I went to you one time at a point of crisis, asked for help in that moment, and you've just gone, well, that's who this person is for his entire life. So, yeah, just that's my warning there, folks.
That's a very timely warning. I broke my arm a few weeks ago, and the last x-ray I had, it wasn't healing very well, and the doctor looked at me and said, do you smoke? As in tobacco. And I did say, yes, I smoke. Point taken, nicotine directly inhibits bone healing. And I've got my next x-ray on Monday, and I was going to go in and say, all right, we've talked about the nicotine, but actually cannabis smoking, is that beneficial or not? But now you've given me that warning, I feel maybe I shouldn't be asking my doctor directly, because that might go down as...
You can ask him if you stand from a neutral position. So as long as you don't incidentally admit, doctor, I'm potentially considering getting a private prescription because I've read about X, Y, Z.
Yeah.
All in the framing rather than a direct admission, because I've heard some horror stories. I'm working with a couple of people I'm not going to mention right now up in Scotland and trying to compile some stories again, just trying to catch up with what's happening of people that are getting some incredible discrimination from the healthcare system for just self-reporting what any academic paper in the world is promoting is fact right now. So it is something just to be mindful of. And it took me many, many years to recognize, why the hell am I getting bounced from pillar to post and really dealt with as such a negative person? And it wasn't until I got a very compassionate young lady who agreed entirely with my stance on drugs, fresh out of training. And she basically flipped the screen around and went, here's your record. And I went, well, can we close down this? This is wrong. That's wrong. This needs to and it was, like I said, it was insane. What that means every time I haven't seen my GP in 10 years or a consistent GP. So every time I've gone in that room with whatever complaint or ailment, they've read that list and gone, this is this person.
Drug abuser, yeah. And
so, that's what they see. So anytime I go, oh, well, cannabis this, or I took mushrooms and that really helped with my depression, they're druggy. So it's a difficult system. And I think, again, that just shows that, to me, it's the same. It's being closeted, to go back to that analogy. And in a way, it's, as a cannabis person that wants to be out, we're constantly kind of forced in and out, in and out, in and out. Even and I'm a very strong proponent, there's still moments, if I'm passing through a fucking airport, or if I've got a cop in front of me and I'm in a position I can't control that situation, then we all have to kind of submit to it in some way. You have to play that game. You have to kind of go along with it.
Yeah, totally. Me and a few colleagues in the sort of criminology, drug policy world, we wrote an article a few years ago now called Coming Out. And it was reflecting on the issue of whether drug experienced drug researchers, for want of a better phrase, should reflect on and discuss their own drug use experience and how that might relate to their research. And it can be beneficial, negative, or whatever. And we go through the sort of arguments for and against, the academic scientific arguments, if you like, but also the practical arguments for and against coming out. And we clearly lean very heavily, and indeed the conclusion is that we think more drug users should include this reflection on their own experiences in their discussions. And of course, lots of people have rightly got back and said, yeah, but you don't actually do that yourselves, do you? And it's like, yes, we don't. That's the point. Even those of us that are actually really quite open still recognize the limits. And that was, part of the point. Even with these very rational arguments, and even with us all being quite liberal and quite privileged, it's dangerous to fully come out in certain circumstances because of the stigmas that can come from that. I mean, I've come out in other circumstances, and some of us really wanted to come out, but not all of us did, and that would have been a problem. And indeed, not all of us necessarily were in the position of having something to come out about. I feel I should say that. But it did leave us with saying, we basically argued that everyone should talk about their own drug use without talking about our own drug use.
Yeah, it's one of the things. I'm going through this whole thing of fucking autism spectrum diagnoses investigation at the minute, because I struggle with language and truth. Don't mean to be as fastidious and as about it all, but it's just what eats away at me. It really eats away at me. And any of these kind of, oh, how much units did you drink? Oh, doctor, I only drank 8 units last week. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Any of that shit, I can't. I want to be honest at all points. I've harmed, arguably, my life and narrowed the opportunities of it massively by how public I have been. Yeah, but I believe it's the right thing to do because I don't believe in any capacity I'm doing anything wrong. I've had some terrible, like unbelievably difficult experiences on some drugs. And I think I spoke of in a recent podcast, the whole Austin Powers LSD night with Pat, actually, episode 212, folks, check that one out. But these things helped. Like, I was informed enough. As you said before about like the bad trip, a lot of that is leading yourself into expectation on these substances. Your mind manifests, as the old word of psychedelic. Obviously, when I speak of like them as entheogens, promoting sort of empathy and other higher level emotions. In connection. But yes, you sort of project into yourself of going, oh, something's happening. And you think of every Hollywood movie, stupid cartoon interpretation, every thing you've ever seen about these things and you panic yourself into this. Then you start, hyperventilating and you get a bit tachycardic and sweaty palms and then you go, oh, what's the drugs they're doing there? And so you lead yourself into that negative experience. I'm fortunate enough that I've had enough experiences of most things and have been around group settings and brought up in the I suppose, second, third wave of free party scene and learned from, I suppose, masters, people that dedicated decades of their lives to their craft, as it were. And these things can be done safely. They can be done holistically within the community and in the social setting. And we have to have that right to do it. There should be regulation and everything else. But this whole $6,000 for a weekend of ketamine infusions in a darkened room with 2 doctors. I mean, I'm not then saying go sniff Ketaboom Town. I mean, thousands of y'all do. I see you. And I'm not against any of these things, but it's that matching the setting of these things that I think we cannot go too off the chain immediately because of the consequence of the mechanisms of prohibition as we've described, but also the consequence of the propaganda of people's expectation. There's going to be some fuckery, but I think it needs to have these mature conversations that you still have the right to do that in the same way you have the right to go to a pub and drink yourself silly. Obviously, the law says that the publican is supposed to cut you off if you're visibly intoxicated. This is one of the least enforced laws in the entire country. But it's still there that then if you make a pain in the arse of yourself, you can be... I just want the same thing has to then be true, as we said, of individual responsibility, and we have to have that mature conversation, and I don't know how we get there, because legalization, to me, I see as the next iteration of prohibition. It's not liberalization. I see it as it's asset stripping, basically. They then get to be the ones making the money from this. So we just have to pay them, and if we're lucky, we get to be bud tenders and work in their grow rooms and get menial jobs. We don't get to be the Mark Zuckerbergs. We don't get an opportunity. It's another form of class impediment. I mean, shit, just look at the investment in the Tory front benches. Look at it around the world. You look at go to any right now, folks. Go to Google, type International Cannabis Conference, and then look at the speakers on it. Show me the 50 to 60-year-old white dudes, investment bankers, lawyers, people. Like, no offense to any of y'all, but like, where the fuck are you? Where were you? Were you growing it in your bedroom? Were you a Dave? Have you ever been a Dave? Have you ever met a Dave? Have you ever smoked a joint? It feels to me like, and I go back to this analogy of the ending of the criminalization of homosexuality, that it can't, imagine if they legalized homosexuality through regulating it and went, right, you can be gay between 8 a.m. and 8 p.m. You're only allowed in these places, no hand holding, you're allowed to be, this, and they just made all these arbitrary fucking rules for a culture that they were wrong to criminalize and demonize in the first place. It's just, I'm getting animated because I don't know how I love these conversations with people that understand it, dude, because honestly, so many people in this space, whether it is actually in cannabis or in social reform, human rights or whatever, they still can't get past or conceptualize that element that so fucking what? I have the right. I can sit here right now on a live stream, drink myself to death. And people go, all right, bit silly. Yeah. No one's going to advocate to criminalize vodka or go after Smirnoff.
Yeah. We have laws against the violence, laws against whatever. I mean, as you said earlier, it's like, sure, get stoned, drive and crash and kill someone, rightly you should be punished. But you're committing the driving offence. The driving offence is already there. You don't need both. I would stick, I'm absolutely an advocate of legalisation of all drugs. Like, there's no doubt about it. We might go into that. What does legalization mean? But legalization and decriminalization. Let's make that.
I get what you mean. I get what you mean by legalization. It's so loaded.
Let's back away from criminalization and prohibition, and let's have something alternative. But I would still very much, and there's lots of room for debate, and we might not necessarily agree about exactly where there should be regulation. But I would absolutely stick with the drug driving laws, just as I would stick with the drink driving laws. It's like, sure, legalize, but no, you're not allowed to jump in a car under the influence of whatever, because the risk of you causing harm is too great.
I think the only element there is the cannabis compounding versus others. Other drugs seem to have more of a correlation towards the mechanism of, say, how alcohol works as an indicator for intoxication, whereas the presence of cannabis is not necessarily an indicator.
Yes. So how do they measure it?
It's a slightly different. Yeah. But the other drugs, in most other drugs, again, you're not consciously doing it. You smoke a joint the night before, most people will not, if they don't think they're capable or whatever, will then get in the car consciously after just smoking. Most people will then go, well, wait a minute, either because they don't want to get caught, they don't think they're capable, whatever. They still have their rational mind about them. Or if, like I said, they smoked the night before, they didn't smoke, and then get in their car, they'll fail a swab test still. But they were in no way inebriated, whereas cocaine or others, whatever, if you sleep and brush your fucking teeth, you're not going to fail on presence of these other compounds. They're flushing through the system so much faster. So impairment and detection, there's a much more of a stronger correlation. And so, I agree with that. And again, actually, most people that are not polydrug using, because that's when you start to really fuck up brain chemistry. And I guess as an avid polydrug user, you can start to affect your perception and awareness. So whereas then using a stimulant with something else, you may do things that you wouldn't have otherwise done, whereas a stimulant may maximize you and you go, actually, I am not capable of doing this thing. I'm not going to do it. You start mixing these stimulants with alcohol, you're going to make problematic decisions, whether it even is just interpersonally with relationships or in connections with others or something that could potentially lead to these consequences. And again, that's education, set and setting. If you're in the middle of a festival and you then polydrug use with alcohol and something else, you're probably in one of the better settings for this thing. But how much real trouble can you get in? Everyone else is on it. Everyone knows. They're not going to demonize you for it. I've seen countless videos of people almost getting in fights and then people just come and cuddle each other. Somebody throws a fucking inflatable giraffe and everyone just starts laughing. It's not what is painted to be. It's like I said, there needs to be an incentive to create these social spaces. I mean, look at on the solstices or the equinoxes. You go to the stone circle sites around the UK and look at the drug use again in those spaces. That there's so much more than what is currently presented. Whereas I feel the prohibitionists look at those most in destitute situations, driven there by socioeconomic, political consequences and policies that happened to then develop a problematic or an observable relationship to cannabis and other drugs that they then go, aha, the drugs did that to them.
Yeah.
And it just...
You've used the phrase set and setting a couple of times, and I'm assuming you're familiar with Zinberg's Drug Set and Setting book. But if you're not, I can do just the brief. This guy, Norman Zinberg, wrote a book called Drug Set and Setting. And he was a sort of medical doctor in the United States. And he was very much intrigued by how lots of his patients who he knew were drug users, like some of them had developed problems that we might associate with the stereotypical constructions of drug use, and some of them didn't. And he was basically, what's the difference here? So started unpicking the very important roles of set and setting. So the impact of any drug use goes well beyond, or the effects of any drug use, whether that is the way you actually experience it at the time, whether you are likely to develop addiction or an ongoing pattern of behavior or whatever, are as much shaped by the set, so your own brain state, if you like, mood, expectations, whatever, and the setting as they are by the drug itself. Actually, to the point where sometimes even you don't need a drug, and you can think of the placebo effect, or sort of give some teenage boys some non-alcoholic beer, but don't tell them it's non-alcoholic and watch them act drunk. We actually, the set and setting can be more important even than the drug itself. And of course, what prohibition, what laws and regulations do of any type is they change both the set and the setting. So it sort of follows that actually the role of the law and regulation has very direct impact on how people experience drug use and whether they manifest the sorts of things that we might accept are problematic, such as health problems, mental health problems, or becoming violent or whatever. These things are problematic when they happen. That they're not inherent to the drugs themselves, and they are very much shaped by drug regulation, drug law. And we have ample evidence that shows that our current approach, the prohibition approach, through the way it affects both setting and set, exacerbates or creates, and we've gone through this, but it's worth repeating, most, if not all, of the negative impacts of that are associated with some cannabis use. They do increase the chance of there being violence associated with markets. They increase the chance of there being negative reactions, paranoia, whatever. We talk about drug sentencing. It's really important to understand it holistically, and it's important to recognize the direct link between the regulatory framework or legal framework, mapping it onto that set and setting thing, and understanding that directly shapes the manifestation of behavior. But it doesn't help us with the sort of how to change thing.
But maybe it does. My belief, what I've come to through all my work of this, is it's education. It's bringing everyone together. Ideally, my vision would be we giant tent in the middle of the fucking country, throw out these big fucking lassos and pull everybody from every corner that has meaningful, reasonable information, awareness, and experience in these fields together, and we just fucking hash it out. And we truly understand, because none of us can see. I'm lucky. I feel I have quite a wide vision, but I am very much aware of my blinkers, and there's a lot of things that just fall off the sides. And it's a lot of things that I just deprioritize in my own day-to-day life because it doesn't help what I see as my fight.
I am going to have to check there. Sorry. When you say hash it out, was that a deliberate pun?
Oh. it wasn't, but it works. It works. It does work. But I think it's education and it's honest information. This is one of the things that scares me at the minute. Is there is an adulteration is the word, as a consequence of prohibition, in the same way there has been with the substance, as there is with the scholastic endeavor. There's a lot of academics that are producing work that, how to say this politely, doesn't stand up to scrutiny. It's passing peer review because the peers that are reviewing it are also part of what I would allege to be a con, an attempt to, I call it medicinalization. So I'm currently working on part 3 of my series of the MedCon thing, and it's taken me fucking months because I've had pretty shit mental health, and the narrative I'm working on, the script's at nearly 5,000 words, and I'm trying to cut it down a bit. Of the medicinalization of what happened to opium. Opium was very benign, was a thing, people traded it, you could have it, you could do whatever. And then through this evolution of the medicinalization, pharmaceuticalization, the creation of the pharmaceutical industrial complex and patents and everything else, took opium, a very benign thing that was culturally used, socially used. People developed certain problematic relationships akin to, I would say, tobacco today, heightened by racism, classism, and a lot of the issues of the present day when it was created. Then went to morphine, about 40, 50 times stronger. Okay, we've got hypodermic needle. Okay, there's legit use there. Led to an explosion of issues. And then from that, Bayer come along in 1898 and go, oh, here's heroin, sell it to your kids as a cough medicine. And everyone went, well, that's 100 times stronger than this. And, we're cool. Then we got fentanyl, which is then 100 times stronger, 50 times stronger than that. 100 times stronger than that, sorry. And then we're dealing with all the consequences of that. And now we're going, we've got carfentanil. That's 50 times stronger than that. So I think it's 10, once you compound these, it's 10,000 times stronger in carfentanil than fucking opium. Yeah, the idea of a trade of just opium we've lost the fucking plot. And this is what I feel they're trying to do with cannabis. And if they're doing it with psychedelics as well, like I said, with ketamine, with psilocybin, all these people, no offense, folks, if you are signing the petition from the Conservative Drug Policy Reform Group to widen the scope of access of education to psilocybin, thinking you're going to be able to lawfully pick those mushrooms you find every season, you're fucking mental. I'm sorry. They have got patents for psilocin. You pick psilocybin-containing mushrooms, we eat them, or you can lemon tech them and produce them into psilocin. That's the thing to get you happy and fun. YouTube's going to hate this video, but whatever. They hate every fucking video I put up. If you chose so happen to do that in a lawful region, you could do that. It doesn't exist yet, but there may be some free lines yet we haven't discovered. But no, they've got these patents for these analogs, these mirrored isomers that they've created for psilocin, that they want to widen the research for them to create pharmaceuticalized versions of these things. They're never going to liberate us at our level to do our thing. Anything that is towards this is why I struggle with that word legalization, and I have to like air quote it or rebel against it in some way, because it doesn't mean anything. But at the same time, it can mean very specific things at opposite ends of a spectrum. And so when Peter Tosh is fucking singing, legalize it, he means end criminalization. He was never going, allow the corporations to rule it all and enslave my people. Probably the worst thing I could have ever done on fucking camera. I apologize for that. But I'm a big fan of fucking of reggae and dub music, and I always have been. And that was a shit impression. But my point still stands: is that was not what's in with Bob Marley, and I worry about. I'm not going to judge his children and what they're doing and what's happening with like the Marley Foundation, etc. Or Howard and Mr. Nice and the brand Mr. Nice. The legacy of these individuals is being set posthumously by people that maybe don't understand what they stood for. And I'm not saying I understand what they stood for, but I feel if they were alive now, they probably wouldn't be too happy with what is happening. They would be closer to my stance than the Conservative Party that are investing in trying to get legalization in adult use in this country, even though they say we have no plans to change the law and all this other shite. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know. I remember meeting it's Crispin Blunt. He's one of the Conservative Party drugs.
Yeah, I think he's there.
Advocates. And I do remember meeting him or being on a panel with him, and there were like I think Jack Ditchfield was on that panel as well as me and a couple of other people, and I think there was a little bit of how's this going to go? We're all going to gang up on him, and then he was the first to speak, and it's like all of his arguments about actually there should be respect for autonomy, freedom of choice, all of that is like, oh my God, you've actually just given the argument that I would have given. This is really impressive. So what's the problem here? Why is this coming? But of course, on top of that is, as a conservative, how would you then tap that into marketization? I think is a problem. Yeah. I mean, I would be very wary of any model of legalization, and I'll do the air quotes this time as well, that does not allow for individual production, individual freedom to produce your own, frankly, whether that's cannabis or growing magic mushrooms or even making your own MDMA at home, I would say there should be the freedom to do that. If it is legalization, but only in the hands of big business, well, like you, I'm not a favor of that. That is not legalization. That is not freedom. That is... Well, it's something else. And that is why, again, going back to America, that's why Vermont surprised everyone by voting down the original proposal to cannabis there, because they recognize, no, we need to keep this in the hands of, or the option for individual users to keep it in their own hands. And that to me, in my academic work, that's always been an important part of understanding the domestic cultivation market. It is people doing that as it's a statement. I find it fascinating, particularly with the medical users, but to an extent with any sort of small-scale growers, whether they're growing for themselves or whether they are supplying friends. People are essentially willing to commit a more serious crime than just possession. They are getting involved in cultivation. That's a more serious drug offence. It can be interpreted as as a trafficking offence, if you like. So heavier sentences, whatever. People are doing this. They are becoming more involved in crime. They are running higher risks of criminalization of sentences, but they are doing that because they want to actually keep away from the sort of real criminals that are out there, if you like. It's a crazy situation where, and again, particularly with medical users, where we are forcing people to escalate their criminal activity. That they are doing it as the only way, or as the most acceptable way, as the only really acceptable way to secure a medicine that works for them that they cannot get through the limited access under our new legal system. The other alternative is to support crime. So I don't want to support crime. My actual public health services let me down. I have to become a more serious criminal to avoid. It's a crazy mess. Yeah,
it's absurd because actually assumed usage is something that I think the Thai government have tried to do. So they've obviously decriminalized the West reported as legalization, but it's a form of decriminalization. It was a form of decriminalization. There's a slight issue that they're going to have with they're trying to recontrol over 0.2% THC, but fuck me, unless they bring back the death penalty, they are not putting that cat back in the bag. But in terms of what they were saying, you can it's all medicinal. As long as you tell the lie, as long as you're not stupid enough to go, I'm recreationally using this, or that you sell it with a big sign saying recreational, you're basically going to be fine. So I still don't like that in terms of having to have the lie, as it were. But I think if we could get the government to a stance of assuming all individuals that are cultivating for their own use are in some way medicinal, they don't need a clarification or confirmation from the doctor, because, look, it also works as a wonderful prophylactic. In a world where, statistically, one of you and I is going to get cancer in our lifetime, and I can't speak to this because of the Cancer Act in this country, but allegedly there are some studies, from various regions around the world that, show THC and apoptosis and CBD, etc. Why can people not make that informed decision? Again, prophylactic use, or even just, I've got a little bit of a headache, it's an anti-inflammatory, I've got a rash and a cut. The one plant can be made into a multitude of applications. That doesn't need to be a daily consumption. It doesn't need to be, we're stuck in this idea of maintenance medications because of the pharmaceutical paradigm, that they want to create drugs that you need to take several times a day for the rest of your fucking life, because then you're paying money for the rest of your life. It's as simple as that, whether it's in a privatized healthcare system where it's direct to pay, or whether it's in our convoluted system where actually, us celebrating wider access to Sativex and Epidiolex is actually impoverishing our healthcare system and going to harm the system rather than benefiting it. So now this new campaign, I'm writing about this at the minute, I don't know much, I should probably talk about this, it's going to get me in trouble. I like getting in trouble. So the CIC have just started a campaign called Protect Our Patients. And the word "our" rings in my head like a nuclear blast. It is such a dog whistle word to me. Maybe I'm paranoid, whatever. But when it's not saying protect the patients, our patients, it really, I'm breaking it down at the minute for a blog, like I say, but it speaks to the intention of this. And they're then calling for GPs to get wider access to be able to prescribe, but to be able to prescribe their for-profit products, to not wider access for cannabis on the NHS. It's taking the 32,400 and something active GPs in this country, and turning them into salespeople for their cannabis products and brands. They're still going to demonize you and vilify you and call you a drug abuser if you say you grow it at home. And how do most patients know that cannabis works for them? They access it by abusing it, according to the NHS. And then what they're going to try and do, make the doctor go, no, you're abusing the drug. Sign up with this and pay this private clinic, asset stripping the NHS, ensuring that there's less money and resource for everybody else for anything else. And you're double supplementing it because you're already paying tax to the NHS for it to then have to be supplemented out. So just because you're not paying that consultant the 50 quid that one time doesn't mean you're not paying for it. The NHS is supplementing it. It's these convoluted systems that they're creating. So again, it's asset stripping for me. It's
asset stripping. It's also, misses some fundamental points about the benefits of cannabis, the medical therapeutic. I like the term therapeutic because for me that covers both the recreational and the medical and the medicinal, whatever. But where we have begun to legalize some medical cannabis, lots of problems there. But part of the recognition of drugs that can be prescribed in this country, it needs standardization. So actually what is legalized is very specific preparations of cannabis or very specific balances of cannabis. Whereas as almost any medical user will be able to tell you, it's like, well, I've tried a few different things and I know what works best for me. And the more experienced growers will be, and I've even actually begun to tweak this myself and have actually developed a strain that is absolutely the best for me. Because different people, different conditions benefit from different balances of the however many hundreds of different cannabinoids. I lose count. What is it, like 500 chemicals in the cannabis plant, of which about 200 are cannabinoids unique to the cannabis plant. And as well as your cannabinoids, you've got your terpenes and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we talk about the entourage effect. And I mean, loads of medical testing that has finally happened with cannabis has actually found, there isn't a statistical benefit for cancer treatment. Well, no, not if you're going to use your standardized thing instead of actually working out which balance of cannabis does work. So in our sort of small opening up of medical cannabis in the UK, and that's still better than it was in some ways. But in that opening up, we have actually, on the one hand, we're pushing it more and more into big business. You've just talked about, the different ways it undermines the NHS, but it's also arguably undermining the actual medical benefit because it focuses on these standardized preparations and misses the point that what we've learned over the years is that it's the variations of cannabis and the way that you can vary it and choose whatever balance works best for whatever condition, under whatever circumstances, for whatever individual user. We lose all that with the current model. So that's probably another argument for, actually the medical model may not be the best way for legalizing at all, full stop. Not just because it ignores non-medical use, but also because it actually undermines the therapeutic uses of cannabis.
Yeah, it's an interesting one because, as you said, even the studies themselves, then it creates a feedback loop of negativity that amplifies from a position not of the drug's fault or the consumer's fault, but because of the construct of the study. And the people that then carry out the study can't see that blind spot because they live that blind spot.
Yeah.
And so, you have all the scale is way off of the self-reported evidence. And, at this point, thousands of people who are like, got diagnosed with cancer, took a shitload of cannabis oil, no cancer. Oh, well, you fluke, we must have missed some on your report, or lifestyle changes, and anything to avoid these kind of conversations. And it's, I think the herbologists, they're an older group of people than the pharmaceutical sector of healing in this country. We're all considered, closer to homeopathy and apothecary and a bit outdated. There's still an institution that's kicking around and still has some real good use. And I think they have a far better understanding of diversity of genus of plants and of cultivars and chemovars within different subplant species, and different effects. That you can't really standardize nature in the same way. You create essential oils and you create products and you create concentrations of them, but it's then entirely through your own individual experimentation that you understand how it works best for you because of the acceptance of that diversity. The standardization of the typical pharmaceutical drug, it has to go to conform to at least a couple of studies. It could be 10,000 conducted, but as long as 2 fall within the remit of necessary, it can get approval in certain jurisdictions and then become licensable, which gives it automatic licensing in other jurisdictions. And cannabis will not fit into this. It's so diverse of a plant, and our endocannabinoid, what we're calling, I suppose now the hub, loosely, they're calling the hub, the larger collection that has recently been discovered beyond the endocannabinoid system, and its signaling within neurotransmission. We are so intimately related to this plant that to say that it's medicine is an absurdity. I mean, it can be entirely. You can use that plant medicinally to get a desired outcome X, Y, Z. But I think it's far closer to a base nutrient. We should be looking at this, and I think we will be in the next 10 to 20 years, as something closer to vitamin D, vitamin C. And we're going to fortify, my vision is take non-psychoactive cannabinoids, your CBG, etc., fortify that with grains and cereals in the same way that we do with other vitamins and whatever. I think that's kind of an approach for it, is we need to bring it up as a food source first, then allow people to just use it as an intoxicant, euphoriant, as something to enjoy. And if they find benefit from it in their own way, have services that are connected to healthcare, but not governed and restricted by it, to have all of that data and report. And after building millions of people onto a database, you'll then start to understand more of how the plant works than any of these double, triple blind placebo-controlled trials that are just bound to fail. They'll work for these single compound drugs where they've taken THC synthetic and mixed with this and this and this, because the other compounds will create that standard effect. There'll still be a deviance, but obviously the construct of the studies mean you just cut them off too far outside the bell curve. Don't have to think about them. And so they'll get to more sativa X's, more abelones, more Epidiolex over the years. And my worry is the current system is being used to create that data to formulate the design of these new drugs that then will be used in the triple blind controlled studies that will give the outcome that allows them, and eventually they'll just pull the flower. Yeah. And unless we win the plant, and this is again why cannabis is a drug, for all it's been the majority of this conversation, is still a tiny part of what I'm interested in about this plant. They're looking at this as a supercapacitor. It's a battery storage that's greater than lithium. We don't need to be sending kids down tiny little holes to go and die, as concrete, as an alternative to concrete, as a biofuel. Graphene nanotubing that you run salt water through generates electricity. So desalinization could be done in such a way that the war that is coming in the next 10 to 20 years could be averted. Our dependence on Saudi oil and all this other shit. We could change the face of the world with understanding cannabis as an industrial resource if we can get rid of hemp here and cannabis. It's cannabis.
Yes.
Give us the plant back and you can do whatever the fuck you want with it en masse. You can change the world. You can sequester all of that carbon. You can become an independent nation. The Conservatives just had this National Conservative Conference, which screamed big Nazi vibes to me, I'm not going to lie. But there's my politics showing. If you want to talk about nationalism, and we've got to build this country up post-Brexit because Europe doesn't want to fucking help us anymore, what a resource. But it means you've got to let people get a bit high on the wacky-backy so we can fill that 99% of unused land in this country and fucking get a resource there that's actually going to be meaningful.
Yeah, otherwise 250,000 known uses of the cannabis plant, but you've already listed a few that I haven't come across before. 7 times as much, or like an acre of cannabis will absorb 7 times as much carbon dioxide as an acre of woodland. You start using that as concrete, whatever. Like, this is carbon capture. This is one of the best opportunities we have to begin to reverse the greenhouse effect. Not just replacing oil, but actually bringing back some of the carbon from the oil that we've already used. That is all crazy. You could separate that out and say, oh, yes, let's do hemp and pretend it's not cannabis. But that's an artificial distinction. It sort of misses the point. But just for the record, for anyone who is listening, we do get lots of hemp. I think in the UK is the limit 0.3% THC. I can't remember because it's been a while.
0.2.
In a lot of countries, it is 0.2 and some places 0.3. Either way, if you do get a hemp plant, you're not going to smoke it and get high because, you want at least 10 times the THC concentration and arguably more than that because even 2% is pretty rubbish. But there are other ways to extract that THC. For example, simmering in milk and extracting the fat-soluble THC. And if something is 0.2%, well, if you use enough of it, you just need 10 times as much as a 2% preparation or 100 times as much as your 20% skunk or whatever. There are ways to extract the THC from hemp. I don't know why I felt the need to say that, but it's a useful bit of information for anyone who might be interested.
Indeed, and that's why why I do this podcast and we have these conversations. I want to look at a few of the notes that I've made, actually, because we've spoken quite a bit there. Some wonderful points raised. I think some great topics communicated. I'm quite interested to hear about what is green criminology, because I think it leads on to a couple of questions I've got.
So green criminology is the study of environmental crime. But generally, criminology itself is the study of crime, but that covers lots of different perspectives. So the study of crime can start with a very sort of administrative, governmental perspective where we take our starting point as crime as defined by the state, the criminal law, and dealt with in the criminal justice system. But more critical end of the criminology scale, radical critical criminologists would say actually crime is a sense arbitrary. When we talk about crime, we include social harms, we include whether or not it's actually in the criminal law is kind of secondary. Like harmful behaviours, if you like. And as such, green criminology can be the criminology that looks just at the fact that we more and more use the criminal law to try and deal with environmental problems. So we criminalise pollution, we criminalise illegal hunting, whatever. But actually, most green criminology is broader than that and is, if we start just thinking of environmental harm as crime and start using all the knowledge we've built around criminology over the centuries, we can understand causes, effects, potential, prevention, etc. much better. So to do that again, but in a shorter version, green criminology is the study of environmental harm from a critical criminology perspective.
Interesting. So is there, do you see a similar pattern play out in prohibition with the criminalization? Because I always say that wherever you draw the line, industry will build its wall. Like if you say, oh, you're only allowed to pollute X, Y, Z, they will make sure that their particles are 1 point under whatever the arbitrary line is. So I was just wondering, is there a correlatory kind of relationship where there is criminalization of industry or individual.
I can sort of extrapolate from what you've just said. Actually, if you set a legal limit of pollution, then sure, one thing that happens is people just meet that limit. So you've still got pollution, whatever. But actually, other things happen. People exceed the limit, but then resort to bribery and corruption to not get punished for breaching the limit. Or they resort to organised crime to avoid. So let's take a sort of idea of toxic waste. Yeah, there shouldn't be much toxic waste being produced by industries, and we set legal limits, in theory, that can then be reduced to encourage industry to produce a less toxic version of whatever it was doing or produce less toxic waste. And sometimes they do that. We offset that with fines, because you can't lock a company up. So when applying criminal law to industry is difficult because we don't have imprisonment for an industry as such. So fines are often the main thing. But then that becomes part of the cost of doing business. It's like, so sometimes the reaction is, yes, we will actually start to meet the legal limits. Other times it's, all right, we've got to breach them. It's going to cost us a fine. Oh, but we're a company. Well, we'll pass it on to to the shareholders or the customers or whatever. It's never the company itself that suffers. Or it turns out actually organised crime crops up. You get these, and started in Italy actually with the sort of traditional mafia. Basically, we'll take away your illegal toxic waste for you and we will charge you less than the fine would have cost. And you actually get a growth in, we call this secondary green crime in the green criminology world. You get a growth in organised crime to help industry or whatever stay within or meet or deal with the new targets set within the criminal law. So the primary green crime is the harm in the environment. The secondary green crime is actually the way that people turn to other types of crime as a response to this attempt to protect the environment. And yeah, we see industry.
So an example, I'm trying to, I was just going to interject with like an example that my brain came across to help anyone that might not be grasping this, because we are a little bit in this podcast. I do know people like to smoke along, so just in case you haven't quite grabbed the example that came in my head was like flag tipping. When councils banned vans from the recycling centres and whatever else and started to restrict what could be taken there, is then fly tipping increased, and then they cost the council more because they had to go and deal with the fly tipping. So now what they've done, instead of making the recycling systems more accessible, they're installing fucking hideaway cameras anywhere that they think people might be doing this shit, and then going after them and spending X amount in the judiciary to ultimately just slap them on the wrist and give them a fine.
Yeah, and you've seen sort of fly tipping grow as a form of organised crime activity instead of actually, fly tipping historically would mostly just be, oh, I'm too lazy to dispose of something or I don't have the option. But it's sort of an individual crime, like people forget. But now you've actually got services providers are like, we'll take away your rubbish for you because it's harder for you to take the tip, and we will go and dump it en masse. So you've seen a sort of, this new type of organised crime grow out of what arguably was a legitimate attempt to deal with an environmental problem, but was only half thought through. You could definitely make links to prohibition there. It's like, oh, we see a problem, we won't think it through. We see the problem is drugs, so we prohibit it. That generates bigger problems, as we spent the last hour and a half talking about. Similarly, in environmental things, if we are careless about the way that we use the law to try and protect the environment, we end up generating problems that were worse than the original problem itself. That is not to say that we shouldn't use the law to protect the environment. We should, but we should be careful about it. It is a general link about how sometimes the criminal law is not the best tool. Criminalization causes a whole load of extra problems, and maybe there are other legal frameworks that would be better for dealing with the environment, just as there might be other legal regulatory frameworks better help us deal with where there are harms associated with drug use. So there are some similarities there between the green criminology and the drug stuff.
Yeah, for sure. It's, as a criminologist, and it's kind of a wider question, is the pattern that seems to be observed is you go through most policies over the 20th century, exclude the war and kind of the shit and leading up to the preamble of the Second World War. This country was in a really weird fucking place. But let's take post-World War II politics and kind of move forward a bit, leading up to Prohibition for it's only a couple of decades. anytime there was a response to something, it wasn't this knee-jerk ban. It was there's a fucking thing. Oh, well, we're British. We'll do this to British. Let's look at the fucking thing. And we would take time, bring in experts. We'd convene panels and commissions. And we'd look at the thing and we go, well, as a British person, it was very pompous and very arrogant. And this isn't me celebrating. I'm just sort of highlighting it. And then something sort of happens. We end up with prohibition, and the stronger the fervent and protectiveness of conservatives and just anybody on the spectrum of prohibitionist or whatever political persuasion you ascribe to, it seems to be the stronger that prohibitionist reflex has got, the more we seem to respond to other things with a prohibitive attitude. But we know, sat on this side of it, the consequences of what this will create. Whereas it seems that something happens, like the novel psychoactive bill under Theresa May and shit, and all of these changing analogues that were a consequence of prohibition. And then, well, there's all these new drugs. Why is there new drugs? Because we've criminalized these drugs. Well, what should we do? Let's criminalize those drugs. And then they've tried to get ahead of it with this act that then basically nullifies any attempt to create anything useful and safer. I can't understand, Gary. They're not. How can you be educated and I don't know.
I feel in a sense you sort of, you notice that on one level you're answering your own questions.
Yeah. I figured
how can you be educated? And well, the pause is, maybe that's the lack of education is part of the point. In general, in areas of criminal justice in general, post World War II, we had what we refer to in certainly academic criminology as the post-war consensus, not just in crime, but in social policy in general. There was a sort of agreement that actually working out the best solutions to social problems should be left to the experts, not the politicians. And that worked for a bit. And maybe it worked particularly in the post-war period when actually there was so much to rebuild that society really was very much that we're tired of fighting, not just the war, but each other. Let's genuinely work together for what's best. Lessons are lost very quickly. So, people forget what happens when you're at war or whatever. Where was I going with this? I can't remember. But we've seen a return to, we see it even now, we've seen this the last decade or so, the dismissal of experts. Like the politicians are increasingly, particularly on the right, are increasingly, well, actually, fuck you, experts. We stop telling us what to do. Well, we're not telling you what to do. We're just trying to give you some advice or whatever. I don't know, politics, and particularly on the right, but maybe also on the left. And maybe if we had a longer period of left-wing government, we'd notice it more on the left. I don't know. Again, what was my point? Politics is increasingly or returning to be, it's about ideology. It's not about facts. It's not about evidence as much as it should be. It's not like Tony Blair was great at saying we'll do what works. And arguably he was reasonably good at bringing in an evidence base to the policy discussions. That's not the norm for politicians, particularly in a sort of first past the post system. It is. We will appeal to the ideological concerns of the people who vote for us. Most of them are not interested in the evidence. Politicians want to be voted in. There's self-interest as a politician is not doing what's best for the country. It's doing what's best to make sure I win my seat next time. So it's sort of bowing down to the uneducated rather than trying to educate them. And that's not a criticism of the general public. It's just a sort of actually, surely, instead of when the majority want to do X and the evidence says, no, that's wrong, surely the discussion should be, well, let's try and explain to everyone why it's wrong and hopefully bring them on board once they're engaged with the evidence, instead of, oh, but the majority say that, so we'll dismiss the evidence because we just want the majority to like us. Politics is too much about ideology, too much about popularity. First past the post system accentuates that, whereas whatever version of proportional representation you have tends to lead to more balanced lawmaking because you tend to get a wider range of voices. You need more consensus in your parliamentary democracies because people don't have their absolute majorities, whatever. But our system, American system, does. It prioritizes the ideological stance over the evidence-based stance. And I would say probably more so on the right than the left, but it's probably both.
It's interesting because it seems that it's compounded through the generations. So the ardent prohibitionists, I'm going to make a generalization here, maybe Daily Mail reading, clutch, what do you call it, purse clutching grandmas, are going to be just against this because that's all they've seen and it's got worse over time. And it's the showmanship of it, of each election. We'll get tougher on drugs, and drugs are this, and the media obviously jumps in it because these stories sell. You know, there was a really good study that showed the proportion of stories to deaths of certain drugs and the overrepresentation of things like ecstasy, because it perpetuates this narrative that it's such a dangerous drug, which, for all I've got my issues with David Nutt and his use of the word skunk and a few other things with drug science, his equestrian or ecstasy paper was spot the fuck on. Was a wonderful illustration of why we should be allowed to do these things. And actually the responsibility of the system is to, that institution that allows the horse riding needs insurance. You need helmets. At some events you then need to have medical professionals available at the side. The same is true for drugs. We already have so much of the information and stuff available to us. And it's interesting that as we see, the Overton window, sort of the politically acceptable sort of window on the spectrum of politics, I'm sort of describe this for my audience there, is shifting a bit more. Sort of left has got more extreme, or lost or perceived as more extreme. Centrist has become more right. This happened with the dismissal of Brown into that tragic coalition, kind of forced the Lib Dems lost any left leaning, which meant the scales just sort of tipped a bit, and the Conservatives have obviously widened their interpretation of politics with their various handful of leaders we've gone through now. And so because of this, we're now, for various reasons, we're seeing the youth and not conservatizing. As the arguable thing in history has always been that the older you get, the more conservative you become.
Yeah.
And the argument has been made by some wonderful pundits, so I'm not claiming this to be my own observation, that in order to be conservative, you have to have shit to conserve. And the youth don't have fuck all. I'm part of a generation of millennials that are scraping by. We're barely, you take a week away from us and we're done. Like of income, you're barely totting through. And so I think as they're not going to get more conservative, as that generation of the purse clutchers kind of, I'm sorry, bless you and all, die off. The same with the politicians that then seek to appeal to that. There will be an evolution. As I said before, my fear is just that, especially in this country, that a version of legalization then creates another lobby power inside Parliament that can use its money and influence to ensure that the little man never gets free. I'm thinking of Stan in South Park fucking blowing up the home growers when he first set up his weed farm. Like, they'll still use the law as a weapon against us. And anywhere that there is a postcode lottery or not a codifying in law for equality and equity, there is going to be a space for people of different ethnicities, backgrounds, classes to be disproportionately targeted by these laws. It arcs me, man. It really just...
It arcs me as well. I mean, I'm optimistic that the younger generation, I mean, you're just saying, the youth are not being as conservativized as much or whatever. I might have slightly misquoted or misremembered or whatever. They've basically got nothing. Like, you've got to have something to conserve. They've got nothing. So that should be a real opportunity for like a massive swing to the left. They really should. Unfortunately, where I'm less optimistic is that sort of, I don't know, the historical examples always seem to be, well, it always swings back eventually. And although our current younger generation, you may think, well, they don't look like they're going to be conservativized in the same way going forward. It's like, well, at the moment, they've got nothing. At some point, they'll have something, and then they will become conservative because they will want to protect what they have got. And that's how, the right is always so successful, is like, whatever little you have got compared to the rich and powerful can always be presented as you've got something and other people are a threat to you even keeping what you've got. Mm-hmm. Hence the othering, hence the foreigners or the people with different sexual persuasions or the drug users or whatever. There's a sort of inherent, and it helps that the media generally is on the right because it's generally owned by the right, but it's easy to pitch or to basically convince people, however little you've got, you have got something and it's under threat from these other people. And that's how they become conservativized, I think. So we still might have to deal with that. But sort of like you, I think short term, actually, I am optimistic that we get quite a good swing to the left, which doesn't necessarily translate into drug change, because Labour, bless them, and I'll probably vote for them just out of lack of choice, but their stance on crime in general and drug policy in particular is really irked me. It's like, why are you doing this, guys? You could just be quiet about it, quite frankly, and no one would notice. But it is frustrating when your leading left party seem to be just as draconian on drugs as your leading right party. Yeah.
It's a deeply frustrating situation. I mean, going into the next election, without boring my listeners too much with too much politics talk here, still have a little sign of politics talk that comes up. I think we'll end up with a rainbow coalition, to be honest with you. I think we are heading towards a position in, let's coin a phrase here, late stage neoliberalism, which there cannot be consensus, because there is so, especially now in an age where, we're in a new NU wave feminism. We have, sexual equality and rights being codified around the world, and a great movement for, like I said, gender and sexual equality, and workers' rights has fallen off a cliff. Obviously, that's a major fucking issue. But in terms of people then being able to identify with groups and gather together, for all they can still use the drug war against us, think about Lickman and Richard Nixon and the whole reason for the war on drugs, when they talk about vilifying the blacks, and I'm quoting, the blacks and the hippies and the anti-war left, and vilifying them on the evening news and break up their meetings in their communities. They can still do that, but I think enough people on that side of it will kind of go, well, what does it fucking matter? How does it matter it doesn't matter how you identify now with your gender. It doesn't matter, who you were in a sexual relationship, if you're a thruple or quadruple, if we still have issues around polygamy in terms of marriage. That's not going to be dealt with, I think, in a still a very strong Christian country. But in terms of those identity and everything else, we're moving forward with that. And to kind of, I suppose, full circle back where we started with, it's that identity. I think people should have that protection. That's not to say that you have to then embody that culture, but there's so many people I know that cannabis has spoken to them, and that's become such a part of their life that to hide it is analogous to them hiding their sexuality and being shamed by it, but worse, feeling like it was 50 years ago, that they could be imprisoned for it, they could be targeted for it, and society will not stand up for them. Plus that panopticonic socio-economic issue, all these things together means that the average drug consumer is carrying the weight of the fucking world on their shoulders, regardless of if they've then got underlying trauma that they may increase their likelihood for dependency and problematic interactions with these compounds. And then they've got nowhere to fucking turn to, because everyone then shames them for this. It's these spirals, it's mental, and I see it in young white men a lot. And that's not to say that other ethnicities don't suffer with it, but I mean, there's something, especially in impoverished white communities, where young men still don't fucking talk. Whereas a lot of ethnic communities in the UK typically are more integrated within families because of the drug war in the UK. I know kids around here that their dad went to prison for drugs, their dad's dad went to prison for drugs, you know what I mean? And they're now in drugs, waiting for their chance to be fucking caught up in this shit show. It's fucking... I share your optimism. I do share your optimism, but I wish there was more of a space to show the lived tragedy, the daily suffering of some people in these spaces, that even their drug use might tot up to less than fucking 400 quid over a month of various fucking things, but the struggle they go through to acquire it, to make the money for it, to live around the system, to avoid it takes up their entire life for something that somebody who goes, I want McDonald's, just drives to the drive-in. Compare the fucking harms. That's what I just want society to just kind of to do that. And then even if the harms are worse, and what?
Yeah, I mean, I don't see a way that the harms would be worse. It does occur to me that if my sort of assessment of situations are, harms related to drugs are definitely worse because of prohibition. Mm-hmm. I have to say that I'd have to leave the possibility that if after legalization and decriminalization I was proven wrong, I might have to question my starting point. But I also do not imagine, I cannot see a way where any form of legalization, even the forms that we don't really want, actually ends up in a more harmful situation than what we have at the moment. So see, I wanted to go back to a couple of things. I think a rainbow coalition at the next general election would be the best thing. I think that would actually probably lead to electoral reform, which would break the dominance of the traditional sort of inbuilt dominance of the Tories under the first past the post system, but also begin to diffuse the sort of ideological thing that I was hinting at earlier. It's like when you've got space for actually not just the loudest voices on this side versus the loudest voices on this side, when you've actually got much more widespread representation of viewpoints, I think that is when we might see some real change. I still think drugs will not necessarily be a priority, so it'll take longer for us to see the change we want on drugs, because there are, as we've already said, more important things to unpick first. But that was worth mentioning. And the other thing I wanted to mention was, because we haven't mentioned it yet, is Scotland. Scotland, where the drug-related harms are more extreme in that drug-related deaths are some of the highest levels in Europe. But the conversation around drug policy in Scotland really is very different to the conversation around drug policy in the rest of the UK. And they really have created more space for the user voice, for for considering alternatives to prohibition. They're having discussions which are still taboo in England, or at least taboo amongst politics. And the actual politicians are getting involved in some. So I think hopefully we can learn a lot from Scotland, so long as it doesn't break away too soon, because my most depressing version of the future is that Scotland leaves the UK and Scotland goes on to do the right things with drugs and loads of other stuff, and we just get left with a heavier inbuilt Tory majority and regress. Save Scotland, please save Scotland. Scotland, if you're listening, please don't go.
See, I share it up to the point of the feeling depressed about it. I guess I am pro-Scottish independence, pro-Welsh independence, but it means that England needs a fuck ton of reform, because I'm also pro-reunification of Ireland. And I think I must have Scottish in my blood, because there is something in me that's like, I don't care, sacrifice me and the rest of the English cohort, and Scotland will prove it. Guarantee you give them full autonomy, they will be in the EU in a minute. They will join the fucking euro. Their economy will go through the fucking roof. They will look at self-sustaining fucking energy. They will end the drug war. They will look at a form of very liberal, I believe, cannabis production. They will then go into whole hog industrial production with, if you want to call it air quotes, hemp or cannabis, whatever. They will go into that. I think, they would advance this little island far more, but they'd draw a hard border. I think that would be the hardest thing of this is the border issue. And I think that's what's going to stop either independence for the conjoined nations, as in Scotland and Wales, they're attached to us. I think Ireland, sectarianism and the whole issue, everything that's gone on there for so fucking long, it's generational to a certain way. And generally speaking, the older world interpretation, or the old interpretations of the old world Judeo-Christian religions are getting modified in various different ways. They're all updating, they're all forming, and certain prejudices and grudges, and I don't mean to lessen the troubles or anybody's belief on either side there. Other things are more important now. What is happening to Northern Ireland as a country because of the fucking England and Parliament, whatever side you stand on, is shit. And I think the only way to solve that is you have to go to the other guys and do what the South Africans did, Truth and Reconciliation Committee, bring everyone together and go, all right, what the fuck, okay, we understand, let's do this, no repercussions, draw a date and a line, anything past that, and we forgive, we forget, we live, we move on, because you're all on the island of Ireland. You know, that's going to get me into trouble with some of my Irish listeners. I apologize. But I mean it in the best of senses. I don't mean it in the sense of get rid of it. I want autonomy for people in this country. So I agree. Proportional representation. When that was thrown on the cards and we had that election, I was out there with anybody I could speak to. Was like, "Does this fucking thing, come fucking vote? You know, register here, dude. Go on the thing. Get on the website." Like, it was, if you don't do anything, that was the thing to get involved with. People never change nothing. I'm like, this is the one vote that could change something. Yeah. And everybody was just so full of apathy. And to go back to kind of that point of the voting systems, I think that eventually the parties have to adapt or die, because I think either there'll be such a surge in the Greens or whatever, and then people will go, well, we just did you to get you in to get rid of the others, and now we're going to build up these other little independent, and there'll be new party politics forming. I mean, you saw how quick something like the Brexit Party, you know, UKIP that became Brexit, how fast they actually built. Obviously, they had the resources that Ashley guy I can't think of the name of.
Dreadful names, but I know who you mean.
Yeah, and all his money and backing. that people want something different. They want something different. A lot of what breaks it is most people will admit in their regret, as we're terming it these days, that it was a protest vote.
Yeah.
It was a fuck you to the system. And it was just to do anything. It was in the same, to go back to the prisoner analogy, it's the dirty protest. Do you know what I mean? It's somebody forced to such a point where they have nothing else in the world that they can do to show their contempt, to exert their rage at the system that is holding them hostage, that they have to smear shit on the fucking walls. That's what it felt like. And I feel like now most people, again, are still so disenfranchised and disillusioned that we look at this and go, well, they're no better. And because of Keir Starmer, they are no fucking better. His stance on a load of this shit, like this, I just literally 5 minutes before we started recording this, I saw, oh, what the hell is her name? She's a Scottish bird. She's the head of the Royal College of Nursing. And she was speaking the other day. Pat McGowan, maybe? I think her name is something like that. And her speech on talking about like immigration and migration and the NHS and all, it was just like, how the fuck are you? Where is that in any single politician that is in British mainstream? There is not a soul amongst them. The one guy that actually had something about him, that, yeah, call him a dick or dislike his politics or whatever, Corbyn, frankly, as far as I consider, he was the only one that would at least have considered some things. He had some blind spots, as we all did, but I guarantee you he's one of the people that would have gone, get me those experts. We don't fucking know. Figure this shit out. Tell us what the thing is. We'll change our mind accordingly. Whereas, again, as you say, Keir Starmer is another ideologue. He is coming in this with a perception, because he's come from the background that he has to be the police and crime prime minister. He has to stand up for the rotten decay, deal with the rotten decay at the heart of Britain that is a consequence of neoliberal policies. So he's going to fix this with harder neoliberal policies. It's when these humanist approaches, again, as we said before, it's like what I said during this getting personal a bit, but during one of my autism assessments, the woman sort of asked me about empathy, and I said, look, I don't necessarily need to empathize with you or any other person on this planet. I can understand that if I was raised you, born as you, lived as you, I would act as you. That's enough. You're entitled to be you. Whatever that looks like, it may be whoa to me. I might even get offended by it. You haven't offended me. I took offense to you, so that's a check for me to go, 2 seconds, why am I offended? Oh, it's because I did it. It's all part of the social contract that has been eroded because of prohibition. I swear to God, that is if you can take away drug prohibition, it's like fucking throwing salt on a flower bed, and that's all the prohibition has done, and we're destroying the ground. But the roots are there, the balls, everything, it wants to grow, and every season it tries. And they come in their fucking gangs, the uniforms and their sirens and their fucking calligraphy on the side of the vans, whatever you call it. Do you know what I mean? Like the logos and not totems, the iconography of it all. And all of it is just, it's gang behavior. And they're out here threatening us. When you look at the Pelian principles, and I've had cops have a go at me for this, but actually he wrote in one of the principles that the observance of the police is not to be used as a measure of how good the police are doing. The absence of the police shows that things are fucking good. Yeah. But then we've got, oh, look at me, I've got a machine gun at a fucking event with kids running around. Oh yeah, things are really safe, aren't they? Like, it's just, we've lost our fucking minds because of prohibition. We truly have. I read the summation and introduction of the guy who's the current CEO of hosts Nimbin, the Cannabis Freedom the Nimbin Festival in Nimbin in Australia. It's the Cannabis Freedom Festival. And he said that prohibition has made us lose our fucking minds. That the way that we police this and the way that we act, we've lost our humanity with the way that we interact with authority, and the idea of authority is being predicated on prohibition. We're doing this for your safety. Look at cars. Is the wonderful analogy. Cars are invented and we have drugs. All right, people are dying from cars because the glass, it's solid glass, it's smashing, it's tearing them up. They're flying out of the doors and shit. All right, seatbelts, safety glass. All right, they can't see with mirrors, lights. All of these advancements, every time we found a problem with this activity that humans do en masse, we've used good, positive regulation, slight bit of criminalization in a punitive, in like a really soft punitive measure, not in a fucking like judicial criminal mechanism.
Well,
to coerce people, well, yeah, eventually.
Most extreme bits, but rightly so. We say, the causing death by dangerous driving, for example, does remain rightly dealt with criminally. But yeah, use the extreme measure of the criminal law for the extreme parts of the thing you're trying to...
Imagine it the other way, and they went, all right, it's not our responsibility. They're driving. Get rid of the roads. Tear up all the roads. Accidents start going through the roof. Oh, fucking hell, we're going to start raiding the mechanics, arrest the mechanics. They're shut the garages. They're selling paraphernalia. Do you know what I mean? And go after it. And then so they can't keep their cars safer. So again, they crash more people die. There's more injuries. You know, the cops are then going after them, and they've got to have the special adapted fucking vehicles. And you can see the absurdity of how fast that would turn into mass genocide. And I'm fearful to use that fucking term, but when you actually look at the war on drugs collectively since not just Nixon, but if we go back to the 1840s and the British starting it in Mauritius, millions, tens of millions have died. Worse, hundreds of millions, if not billions, of people have lived under that panopticonic version of society. They have never known freedom. Worse, they've known that they don't have freedom. The other ones that have never interacted with drugs don't see the bars, because the impediment has never been placed upon them, because everything they want to do is fine. It's the same thing with the protest laws recently, and people are like, yeah, arrest those Republic people, arrest those anti-oil people. Yeah, but they've just codified into law systems that mean that when you want to speak out, you're done too, pal.
Yeah. Well, you know, I didn't speak up for I forget that quote, but, you know.
The poem, yeah.
The poem, and at the end, there was no one.
First they came for the blah, blah, first they came for dirt, first, and then when I spoke up, there was nobody left.
Yeah.
That's where we're, and if again, there was Jacob Rees-Mogg was interrupted at this this Conservative National Conference by a speaker, very eloquent man. I didn't catch, I only saw a clip of it. And he first he spoke, Jacob stepped back and allowed him to speak for a second because he was a posh white man. Everyone was like, oh, it's okay. They didn't burst into things because he wasn't a young activist man. And he basically went, I want to speak today on the early signs of fascism and security come from all things, and drag him off.
The irony.
Exactly. And Jacob, they were talking about freedom of fucking speech in this, and it was just, this is what I've been saying about how bad my mental health has been. It's partly my own life, and I'm dealing with my own shit, my own trauma, and I deal with my reality, my neurodivergency. But I see this shit in the world, and it's gaslighting. It's worse. It's not even just lies and manipulation. There's no the sportsmanship we spoke of before, even that's been taken away. The speed camera vans are now being hidden. Civilians can grass you up with cameras they've installed in their own vehicles. Everything's getting a bit fucked up. It's all a bit Black Mirror, is where I feel like we're sliding. And again, it's then, am I paranoid or am I too informed? And I end up bouncing back and forth between this. And the psychiatrists that I speak to and the people that I deal with in the mental health services literally still shouldn't be telling me this, but tell me to just maybe not look at that, maybe not engage with that. And I'm like, well, I've clearly got a hyperfixation problem around this subject. And I say it is, I'm at war. The state has declared war on me. I'm an enemy combatant for how I live, even how I smell could get my life ruined. I have to be careful of my smell when I'm moving around this world. I cannot explain that to other people that don't quite get it. Then maybe I'm fully out of the cannabis closet. Like I said, other than those occasional moments where it's suicide to not be. I don't ever want to go back in that, because it makes me feel more authentic, more real, more who I am. I feel like I'm standing up for those people that yet cannot speak and have their voice heard. And I just want to fucking do something about it and get others to go, well, actually, you're right. And it shouldn't just be 420 where thousands of us can get together in a park and do this and risk it. It should be integrated into our lives, because it would become as benign as coffee. It wouldn't be as you're making it, as you talked about the forbidden fruit, you're making it all this sensationalist, you're hyper normalizing it, not hyper normalizing, I'm trying to think of the wording. You're turning the culture up to the extreme, up to 11. You're hyperinflating that image of it and that persona and the allure to it and the taboo and everything else. And some, potentially negative aspects of that have created consequentially of prohibition, not of cannabis. And you're going to heighten that through prohibition, not lessen it. Whereas if you bring out the dads and the granddads and the boring people and I want to grow in my greenhouse with me tomatoes, and that spectrum becomes aware, it lessens so much of that stigma to recognize that anybody and everybody can be a cannabis consumer. It's not just the people with the emblems on the t-shirt or running around with the big joints and blasting the music or being that proud and open. I mean, there should be obviously the lawful protection space for everybody. There's antisocial behavior laws. Obviously, if you're blaring music too loud in a certain space, then you'll be asked to move on, moved on. But it shouldn't then be, oh, you're a cannabis person. We don't. It's like I said, there are laws that govern the rational way that we operate in society, and all we want for cannabis is personally for me, is an erasure of the laws against us of the cannabis-related offences, not the creation of new legislation that further regulates my life when it doesn't need to.
Absolutely, totally agree. And I do think, one of the most powerful things that could, and easiest and most powerful, because, the cannabis campaign movement, if you like, and it's changed a bit with the somewhat artificial separation of medical campaigning versus more old school campaigning. But the old school campaign groups, if you like, I mean, there is a type, a stereotype, if you like, and that in some ways I think is counterproductive. It's easy for the media and it's easier for the uncertain mainstream and the old people with their clutch bags or whatever to point at the hippies with their crazy hair and clothes and say, doesn't matter how many of them are coming out as cannabis smokers, they're clearly other. I think it's really important for the more normal looking, if you like, users to also stand up and be counted. And let's not have the cannabis constantly associated with deviancy, dropouts, whatever. Even though we know that just looking that way doesn't mean you are a deviant or a dropout. But I'm sure you get my point. But yeah, I wish more of you middle-aged, short-haired, suit-wearing cannabis users would stand up and be counted, because that's when we will get change. Look in politics, how many of those politicians actually do have their own history or potentially current patterns of illegal drug use, but will never stand up and be counted. But if more of them did, if more of the doctors, I mean, I've interviewed hundreds of people who grow their own cannabis, and sure, some of them have dreadlocks and some of them are hippies and some of them wear tie-dyed clothing and a lot of them listen to, reggae or whatever. But quite a lot of them are professionals. I've interviewed doctors, I've interviewed lawyers, I've interviewed judges. And that's not just the smokers, that's the growers. I mean, the smoking body, everyone. And yeah, I just wish that more of them would stand up and be counted.
Exactly. The image of cannabis and its association to the lower class when it's for recreational or adult consumption is an absurdity, really. I think of that video of Boris Johnson, was it 2001 or whatever it was, and he's talking about, I know some quite bougie types that, after work enjoy a good old spliff. And yeah, all walks of fucking life, and because of its accessibility, it is in terms of you can just fucking grow it yourself. And if you're well-to-do and you have a big old house in a driveway, who's going to fucking smell it? Who's going to detect it? Who's going to be aware of it? It's that.
Even if they become aware of it, if you are of that demographic or whatever, you're not going to be sent to prison. But even if the police are aware of it, they're going to come and informally, like, oh, you've been reported, maybe you could hide the plants or whatever. You're not going to get the caution, you're not going to get arrested.
You're not going to get the big raid.
You're not going to get prosecuted, you're not going to get the raid, you're not going to get the prison sentence or the fine. So that sort of cultural capital totally protects you. And but arguably, to me, that's even more of a reason why more of those people should come out. Like, they would presumably mostly say, well, I'm not going to admit to it because of the stigma. We've talked about stigma. They're the ones, in some ways, the stigma seems most extreme because they are so far away. But it's the one also where the stigma is going to have least impact on. Actually, your upper middle class white men are the least likely to end up in prison if they do come out as cannabis growers or get arrested or whatever. So stand up and be counted, please, all of you.
100%. And it's an interesting paradox, isn't it? That I don't want to come out because of the stigma. And it's like, well, the stigma is perpetuated by people like yourselves that
not coming out. Yeah.
Not coming out. Obviously, there are the people that promulgated this idea and these conceptual ideas of propaganda and repeat it and regurgitate it. But yeah, you literally not standing up to it. It's one of the things, as I said to you, I used a pseudonym when I first started this with Winston Smith from 1984. And then Facebook required me to show them their ID. And I tried to explain to them, this is not my real fucking name. Here's my real name. I want to keep the account and everything I've built. And they're like, no, you need to show us this with your birth date, 20th of April, fucking 1984. And I was like, I can't show you that document. Clearly it's a joke. Please understand what I'm telling you. And it just kept coming back with automated messages. And I was like, fine, fuck it, take my account. But since then, like, it's liberating, it's freeing. And I feel an obligation, but with a certain element of pride in it, to speak up for those that cannot speak, not just those that are currently active in what they're doing, but those that came before me, that gave me the space to do it, that went to prison, your Howard Marks, your other people that didn't roll over and go, actually, yeah, I'm a bad person and I'm sorry. And they just went, no, fuck you. The Gary Hughes of the world, the people that have just gone, I will fight this. You are wrong. And we honor that. Not just gathering at 420 and being, fuck the police, and I get some Instagram pictures, and that's not dissing any of us for doing that. I enjoy that, participate in that, I get it. But that's not the only form of activism. Speaking and coming out to your parents, to your family, to, if you can, some of your colleagues, if it's not going to jeopardize your job, you know what I mean? To your neighbors and shit. You'd be surprised the number of people that live right next door to another weed smoker that are trying to hide that weed smoke from the other person, that then go, oh, she's my weed. Oh my God. It's such a social lubricant that is being denied to us, not just cannabis, but like I said, of all drug use, that yes, it can become problematic. And I say this as a plea to the cannabis community, a large portion of this audience, that to challenge your own drug supremacy, this own idea of the drug exceptionalism, that my drug is better, this drug is safer, those drug people are bad. You're observing a small portion of that population, and that is not a representation of the entirety of that drug-consuming population. And by demonizing each other, we're crabs in a bucket, keeping each other down.
And almost by definition, the ones that you do get to see are not representative. I mean, we talked about the media, and you mentioned earlier sort of the disproportionate coverage of ecstasy deaths. And of course, in some ways, that's how the media should work, because it is the rare example that is news. So in some ways, but I mean, there's more going on here, and I'm not like there's the whole right-wing media stuff. But in some ways, well, no, you'd expect the news. But we should all know that, yes, the news is reporting the exceptional case. It's not the norm. The stereotype of the junkie, whether it's because they're the ones we see on the street or they're the ones reported in the news, is not the representation of the average heroin user. The average heroin user is pretty similar to the average cannabis user. That they never come to our attention because they're not getting involved in crime, they're not having health problems, they're not looking like junkies, they're not homeless. So our understandings of what is normal. So we know this, because we're drug users of other types, but we then forget to apply those lessons when we think about others. So yeah, your point of forget your own drug exceptionalism and sort of remember that actually this is true for all of them. I totally agree with, yeah. And let's, start with that. Actually, drug use in general is not a problem. Some people develop problems. Those problems tend to reflect other things going on in their lives and or the enforcement of drug policy. But those people clearly need help. But because of the stigma around drugs, the people who need the help most are least likely to seek help. So you're actually making their problems worse in another way. We've already discussed lots of others, but the people who need help are further pushed away from getting help because of the stigma of coming out as... you end up perpetuating the problems and the stereotypical images that then generate, that then inform people who don't really know any drug users themselves. So they just pick up what they see in the news or on the, it just perpetuates. And that's where we are. And that's where we've been for the last 50 years. And hopefully that's where we will see some change in the coming years, but I don't know.
More transparent.
Let's be optimistic. We've talked about optimistic things, and then every now and again I go back to being pessimistic. Like when I was a PhD student, which was about 20 years ago, I was, writing about how, there seems to be very much this move towards legalization. And my supervisor at the time sort of said, yeah, no, it's great, there is, but I remember 20 years before that. So, go back to 60s, 70s, you think, this is surely going to be the beginning of legalization because hippies are becoming, a mainstream, blah-de-blah. And then in the 90s, it really did feel, maybe we're on the beginning of something that's going to change. You had the Free Party movement and the Second Summer of Love and blah. And then we see repression again. And then recently it seemed optimistic and we've seen change. But I fear that might be just another example of the 20-year cycle of up and down. And then other times I think, no, it really is different this time. It really is different.
Got my fingers crossed along with you.
I've got my fingers crossed as well.
Yeah, all good points. I think I've got two quick speed questions. Then we'll wrap this up if that's all right, because it's I've just realised how long we've been chatting here.
Yeah, but it's going on for 5, and I resent being in my office too much after 5, but I don't mind carrying on talking. But yeah, quick fire question. Go.
Excellent. It's I suppose for the humour of it all. How did you feel when the Harry Potter books came out? Is it one of these things that people hear it and immediately kind of like a joke?
Didn't notice it at all. And then one of my colleagues, when I was still at Sheffield at the time, and one of my colleagues brought her son in and brought him down to knock on the door and say, look, this is Harry Potter. And up to that point, no one had ever really made the connection. But then, of course, it's still quite regularly. I check into hotels or onto trains or whatever. And, I travel for conferences. And yes, at least half and probably more than half the time, people look at me and go, oh, that's an amusing name in whatever variation. Meh. I know it's supposed to be quick fire, but when I was a teenager, I was actually a professional magician, like earning money, had an agent and everything. And nice. So as a 14 to 18-year-old, I was a teenage wizard, and I have a birthmark on my forehead that only really shows up in times of stress. So I actually think J.K. Rowling based Harry Potter on me, and particularly if the university pensions continue to go pear-shaped, I may well sue her at some point, just to,
A good retirement plan. I like it.
Yeah.
I like it. I think a small question there. I think we've covered actually a great deal of these. This is the short one I wanted to do. Your Twitter bio describes you as an amateur traveller. Where's the favourite place you've been? Favourite place you want to go?
Favourite places I've been, I'm going to go with 2. Colombia, where I got mugged within my first 24 hours, and then went on to have an amazing experience, and actually went back taking my dad, and Uganda, which has currently seen some horrendous changes to the law around homosexuality, and I would not defend that for a moment, but where I've also had some great experiences in Uganda, including going to a village in the middle of nowhere, and I'm definitely not giving away any clues, but a colleague of mine was working out there doing her PhD, and when I got introduced, she'd clearly been talking about me, because the first thing they did was disappear into the bush and come back with some cannabis and say, this is what we grow, we hear you like it.
Nice. That is the best welcoming. I do enjoy being greeted that way.
Sorry, what was the last
second part was where sort of on your list?
I really want to go everywhere. I really, really do. So it's always hard to say, but I think more parts of South America in particular, and actually I guess pretty high on the list should be Uruguay, because obviously the professional interest to actually go and see what's happening in Uruguay under their version of legalization, which seems to have so much potential. It's got teething troubles, policies always do. So I think, Uruguay would be top of my list, because I can combine my environmentalist interests and my drug policy professional interests and my general traveling interests. And I've got a tiny bit of Spanish, so I can cope better in South America than some other places.
That'd be excellent. I want to see more studies. The stuff that's coming out of there is very skewed. It's either coming from parts of political party, parts of the political spectrum that no, we need to retract this. So they've designed these studies, or cherry pick them into such a way that the data is basically useless, or it's from the other side of a highly corporatized thing. And again, it's not really accruing or correlating and explaining the data in a meaningful way. They've just butchered it to go, this proves our point. There's obviously it was supposed to be short, but whatever. There's a new bill being put in. There's a guy who is one of the partial owners of Sunderland Football Club down the road from me, the son-in-law of a multi-billionaire Russian oligarch, and he's a senator in Uruguay, I think, and they're pushing a bill for like decriminalization of, they've called it natural psychedelics, but MDMA is on there, fucking, there's a few other things on there, and it's interesting. It's a very interesting country, and as you say, because of preservation and that being part of it, I think it would be interesting to see what they're going to look at doing in terms of tourism for retreats, etc., what they could do more with cannabis as a regenerative agriculture. And yeah, it looks like a beautiful country.
Yeah. And what's really interesting about Uruguay was, so when we've seen legalization in various American states and in Canada, and to an extent some other places, it's very much been sort of led by public opinion. So particularly in the US states, it's referendums that have led to legalization. And whereas Uruguay, public opinion was actually totally against legalization of cannabis. And that was actually an example of the government saying, no, we've looked at this, we understand the evidence, and we think it is the right thing to do, regardless of whether it makes us popular or not. So that decoupling of evidence-based policy from the popularity game side of democratic politics is fascinating. I really hope that they succeed. It is easy, as you said, there's like the cherry picking of evidence for people who would like to see that policy reversed. I'm glad that the government seem to be sticking to their guns and indeed looking at other developments in the liberalisation of drug policy. So we'll all watch Uruguay with interest. And to go back to the quickfire question, if I can watch it with interest by also going there at some point, then that would be excellent.
Nice. I'll quickly ask you my last question as well. Sorry, it's what does the future hold for you?
For me personally, well, I don't know. I mean, we've talked a little bit about various things. University sector is one of the current sectors where there's a lot of strike activity because, we don't like our employment conditions and we don't like our pensions. So, I could say future for me might involve leaving academia and starting again. No, what's the future hold for me? I actually really enjoy my work. I really enjoy studying the cannabis stuff, but also the green criminology stuff. I do see, I am optimistic. We've touched on the optimism and the pessimism. In the future, I think I do see further liberalisation in the UK of some form or another, which for me gives the opportunities to then do the studies that can talk about whether changes have been successful or not. So maintain an interest that straddles genuine and pure academic interest with the sort of activist side of me that sometimes I have to hold a bit in abeyance to be taken seriously as an academic. I see a future where hopefully at least medical users, more and more of them, will have their access, and that's a start. But I also think I see a future where actually we will see a liberalisation for non-medical use as well. And me there as someone in a good position to study and write about where it's been successful and how it might need further improving.
Excellent. I do hope, obviously, the liberalisation continues, whatever form it takes. As long as less people are getting criminalised, we can, lessen the fear of the cost and increase more the education, awareness, and access. Then I'm all for it. Yeah. All right. Where can people keep up with your work, with various papers and stuff that you've produced?
Okay. I mean, my staff profile on my university is sort of the easiest way to find me and publications so far, if you like. I could not tell you the exact URL, but
I think I've got it. I'll
Lancaster Cannabis, but specifically the sort of global project, collaboration of 18 countries of like-minded criminologists and policy students looking at cannabis cultivation. Our website is worldwideweed.nl. Hosted in the Netherlands. Honestly, it makes no difference, but lots of people are more comfortable looking at some of our work knowing that it's hosted on a Dutch website rather than a British website, and that's me. So they're the two ways to keep up directly, I guess. But I'm happy to come back on. We're actually writing up a load of papers based on our most recent wave of the Worldwide Weed Network's work. Too many W words in there. I'd love to maybe come back, in 6 months or something or even less than that, to talk sort of maybe specifically about where we've got with that and what our findings and outputs are. Or you might not ever want me back again. I don't know.
No, definitely want you back. I've thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. I think there's still a lot of the topics, even on just sort of my notes that I've made, that I'd like to cover again. So as that comes more to fruition, let's keep in communication and make it happen. And thank you very much for being a guest today. I've thoroughly enjoyed this.
Well, thank you. I thoroughly enjoyed it as well. Thank you for having me on.
No worries. It's 5:05, so I'll let you go and get out of the office, and I'll do a bit of housekeeping here and wrap up the episode. It's been a pleasure, Gary. I wish you all the best. all the best, and yeah, we'll speak soon, man.
Weed and best together in some way.
That's the West way.
Excellent. All right. Cheers, Simpa. I will see you somewhere at some point. Take care. Bye.
Peace, love. Well, can't believe I just did that. Went for a piss. Paused the recording, came back, forgot to press record, just sat here and did a 5-minute chef's kiss, wonderful outro. And yeah, none of it was captured on recorded. It is recording. I can see the red light. We are good, folks. We're recording. Jesus. Me and this technology, at least I don't know if you appreciated it. This took me hours of work to understand how the hell to do this. I am not very computer literate, as many people may have astutely observed in the past. But yeah, I do think we've now solved it. Obviously, I need to figure out my configuration of stuff behind, because every time I bang the table, the light decides to try and destroy all the cables and take you fine folk. I always imagine you just sat in there behind that little camera in a little cinema observing, watching all of this with it. So yeah, I apologize for the abrupt and yeah, throwing around back there. So let me take your seats. I'll let you leave in a moment. So yeah, that was Dr. Gary Potter, a criminologist. Hope you enjoyed the conversation. I really enjoyed that. I thought we covered a lot of good ground. There's a lot that we didn't touch on from my notes that, as we agreed, we'll get him back on when the new study that he is working on in conjunction with a few others is sort of available and the data is ready. It'd be always good to go through that, make some good notes of some things to check out from the conversation that I will add to the old noodle and hopefully be able to speak more on when I know more of at a later date. But yeah, we covered a great deal amount there of politics. I do apologize for people who watch this for the drugs and not the politics. We did get a bit politicky there, but they are so intimately related, the intersectionality between these things. Prohibition is ultimately a political act. If you are anti-prohibition, you are politically active. So we have to be politically informed and educated to be able to articulate what it is that we're against. Otherwise, we end up with exactly what we discussed, the weaponization of language, misrepresenting the spirit and nature of our arguments and our complaints, and we end up with a system that doesn't necessarily represent our desires or wants or needs. So yeah, the more we can dig into this language thing, this legal thing, I think the better we all are prepared for whatever comes next, to be able to challenge whatever comes next, to be able to do what Vermont did, what New York tried to do, to argue for better social equity, to argue for a true end of criminalization, rather. I mean, my ideal, obviously, as I've spoke of, is descheduling, but we'll see if we ever get to that little pipe dream at some point in hopefully my lifetime. I'm still young. I'm still optimistic and hopeful, for all my hairline probably doesn't show that I'm still that young. Anyway, folks, yeah, if you've enjoyed this one, please do give us a like and a share. Every little helps. I'm so close to getting over 1,000 subs. Please help me get there. Hit that little button in the bottom corner. Go and give us a little subscribe. You know you wanna. Go on, do it. I'm guessing you did it. You had enough time to do it. You looked at it. It's fine. It's cool. Yeah, check us out on all social media platforms at The Simpa Life. If you really love the whole show of mine, you can check us out on patreon.com/The Simpa Life, where you can donate towards the show. You can donate towards, I think we've got the equipment down, touch all the wood right now, because I'm a bit nervous we're going to break something now. Yeah, check out thesimpalife.com for exclusive blogs, articles, and more content and various different things that I'll be working on over the next sort of several weeks and months. And yeah, we'll be working on, like I said, or releasing before too long, part 3 of the 5-part series for the medical con. So the people asking for that is in the pipe work, and I am working on it. So yeah, we will come at some point soon. Be good to each other. Tell somebody you love them. Obviously, if you actually love them, don't tell somebody you don't love that you love them. That's cruel. But if you love somebody, tell somebody. You know, go spend some time in company with people you give a fuck about. Go do something you give a shit about. Go spend some time in nature. Go hug your pet. Go do something fucking good that's going to boost that serotonin and dopamine in that little brain of yours. And yeah, I'll see you back here next week with somebody. It'll be wonderful. We'll have fun. All right. Peace and love, folks. I'll see you next week. What number are we on? 114.